right. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate a lot of you flying from different parts of the country for this event today and braving the crazy weather we have on the West Coast. We brewed that up for you, so I hope you guys enjoy. So my name is Ross Noderft. I'm the executive director of the Alliance for Digital Innovation. We are a 501c6 trade organization. We're a group of companies, technology companies, modern cloud-based technology product and service providers that have come together to try and move the ball forward in the public sector space so that more public sector agencies, departments, enterprise owners, mission owners can access the latest and greatest technology that we have. We've been around for about 4 years. I think now we're finally hitting our stride as a trade organization. We're continuing to grow. We're just shy of 30 companies. I think we're going to get some more in the next quarter. People are really paying attention. And I think a lot of it has to do with the work that you all in the audience are doing. Right? You all are continuing to innovate, continuing to provide products and services that really underpin and move forward the missions that the departments and agencies that we partner with, um, they've come to value the technology that you provide. You guys are essential and critical. So, what are we talking about today? What are we doing with this event? This event is all about cloud security. So at ADI, we have a lot of pillars that we care about. We are public sector focused, so federal, state, and local. We do a dash of international public sector policy, but we have four key pillars that we kind of talk and work in. We have IT modernization, making sure that we have access to that technology, the latest and greatest. There's dollars flowing to commercial technology and service providers. We Cybersecurity is a big pillar of ours. We want to make sure that the technology that government is using is safe, secure, effective, and the security can grow as architectures evolve and change, and that people are building policies that enable that dynamic. We care a lot about acquisition. So, in order for us to partner effectively with our government customers, we need to have an acquisition process that enables those government customers to acquire technology when it's relevant. I mean, everybody in this room knows the speed at which we're innovating. We want government to have access to that innovative tech when it's coming out. And then we care a lot about the workforce. We cannot have a public sector that does not understand, cannot utilize, isn't asking for, isn't thinking about how to do their missions utilizing the technology we provide. So we really care about what the modern, technologically savvy workforce looks like as well. So those are the four pillars that we have. But today we are talking about cloud security. Um, we want to cover a range of topics. So we're very lucky, and we'll talk through each of the panel discussions that we have today. But we're going to start just to give you a general sense of what we're going to do. We're going to start with a high level overview. We're going to have Eric Mill, who's going to come in virtually here in a few minutes. He is with the Office of Management and Budget. He is driving a lot of the big P policy that's coming out of the administration around enterprise cloud security. We're going to follow Eric with the discussion with the Office of the National Cyber Director, Phil Stupak, and Grant Dasher from the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency at DHS. So what that represents is your core critical thinkers when it comes to how cybersecurity policy is evolving, both in the public sector as well as across the nation, right? States, in the critical infrastructure sectors, et cetera. So that's where we're going to start. And then we're going to move down into how are we operationalizing cloud security in an enterprise environment. We're going to have discussions with three people. So Lee McGrath is here from the StateRAMP program, and then we're going to have Dave Zvenich, who is the former director of the Technology Transformation Service at TTS, and then we're going to have Brian Conrad, who's currently the acting director of the FedRAMP PMO, talking to us about how we do it, how do we get it done, and then we're gonna wrap up with a discussion with some of our industry partners who have been through the process and are working through the process on a daily basis to really kind of drive that security forward. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to all of our partners, all of our members at ADI, but I especially want to call out the three that helped put this on today. So Zscaler, Google public sector. I'm very excited about your new logo, guys. That's great. And then Stack Armor. So, uh, quick note, and then I'll call each one of those guys up here to introduce themselves. But these panels and these discussions, I want them to be interactive. I want you guys to be able to ask questions. So we'll kick them off. We'll start with a couple of softball questions, get things warmed up. But if you guys have questions, feel free. There are 2 microphones in the room. I'd ask that you guys come up and make sure or ask your questions. These guys are here to talk to you, and we want you guys to get as much value out of it as possible. So, with that being said, I'd like to call up GP just say a quick word of welcome, and then the other guys as well, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Ross.
Yep.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sunnyvale, with also a little bit of wind. I'm from DC, and I thought, okay, we'll go to Sunnyvale, but I find that it is 70 degrees, and when I left, and it's about 50 degrees and chilly. So I think I'm a little underdressed, but all good. Again, thank you for making it here. I'm GP. I'm the CEO and founder of Stack Armor. First of all, thank you so much to my colleagues at the Alliance for Digital Innovation for making this event happen. Also, thanks much to our wonderful friends at Google uh, Public Sector. I hope I got the name correct, for hosting us and for the privilege of being in this beautiful campus. Uh, Cloud security and modernization is very near and dear to my heart. I had the privilege of doing the first US government cloud migration back in 2009 for a system for the White House that really sort of drove this move towards adoption of commercial cloud technologies. And as I hope that you hear from the panel and a lot of the wonderful speakers that we have, that federal agencies, the Department of Defense, and indeed state agencies. I know we have the speakers from StateRAMP here. Thank you, Leah, for making it. Where we just see this pervasive growth of the need for delivering secure commercial cloud technologies. And I think all of us have a pretty significant role to play in that. So, welcome. Thank you for making it here. And I hope you enjoy this session and take the maximum value from this. With that, I will request my colleague, friend, Troy Bertram from Google to come in and welcome you as well.
Thanks, GP. Troy Bertram, Google Public Sector. And we are proud of, I'll start a little bit with the naming convention and the importance of it. So Google is serious about government. From the alphabet level, we have invested in a separate operating division. Quite intentionally, on the 4th of July, we officially launched as a separate operating division under Alphabet. We roll up under Thomas Kurian as part of Google Cloud, but we have a separate board of directors. We have a CEO in Karen DeHoot, who joined us this fall. And we are building to support the US government and stop. And whether that's through awards that we have achieved to support the C2E customers, so the US intelligence community, or whether it's JWCC to support the Department of Defense, or it's our state and local government business and the educational institutions that we support. That's why we exist as Google Public Sector. Complexity of moving into the cloud and lift and shift hasn't been enough to deliver the mission outcomes to support all of our customers in this environment. Right? COVID was a huge accelerator to the business, especially in state and local, where government was slow to adopt cloud. It was a forcing mechanism that we all probably needed as citizen services to accelerate simple things like driver's license renewals. How do I do insurance validation and claims services, right? A lot of it's big data challenges. So whether it's us working across other cloud service providers or on-prem data, we are here to support the mission outcomes of our customers, not just to do simple lift and shift, right? It's a cybersecurity challenge. It's an AI ML challenge, and it's really around delivering citizen services. That said, the underpinning is complicated of how to get there for many SaaS providers and ISVs and startups, whether you're moving into government for the first time or you're trying to accelerate those government workloads, achieving the certifications, IL, FedRAMP, StateRAMP, go down the list. As a community of interest, whether it's GP or I think Steve is following me with Zscaler or others in the audience, we're trying to make this simpler for you all. And it's working with other enterprises like ADI, which I am a board member of. And for those that are interested in our charter and also what we're trying to accomplish, both as large companies and smaller companies, to help digital modernization, cloud procurement, security and compliance, something I really want to see us accomplish this year from an ADI perspective, is a government scorecard of sponsoring agencies, of who is sponsoring and what work have they done to help accelerate FedRAMP, right? It's one thing to have an application and a customer and that initial pilot program, but how do you accelerate broadly across government? We need our government sponsors to also step up across all the civilian agencies and help with that heavy lift. Oh, I'll turn it over to Steve, but we'll be here the rest of the day. And I'd like my Google team to raise their hand. So if you haven't had a chance to meet, hanging out in the back row during a break, grab one of them and we'll see how we can help you. Good to see you as well.
Everything he said, I should just repeat. It's so wonderful. I'm Stephen Kovac. I am the Chief Compliance Officer at Zscaler. I'm also the Chairman of the Board of ADI. So from my heart and ADI, welcome. Thank you for coming. And I hope today is really beneficial for you. A little bit about myself. I've been around FedRAMP since, if you know what the word BPA is, around FedRAMP. Before FedRAMP, it was the cloud BPA. Now it's FedRAMP. That's why I'm fat and bald, because I've been around FedRAMP so long. It's a long time to be with one organization, especially a government organization, supporting it as long as we have, and most of us in the room have. And, to see it get into law this year was a tremendous, tremendous achievement for the team. Kudos to all those that helped. And I think it says something for where this program is going. It's not going away, right? So we have to become successful at it. At Zscaler, in my career, I've done double-digit FedRAMP certifications, accreditations, annual assessments. I have Zscaler. We currently have 2 moderate platforms. We have 2 high platforms. So it's 4 FedRAMPs as well as 3 IL5s, and we're working on IL6. So you can see that we've been through a lot, right? So we have some experience in this space. We are, if you don't know Zscaler, I'll give you a quick definition of us, who we are. We are the largest security cloud in the world. So we have, in our commercial cloud, we have over 150 plus data centers around the globe. I can't give numbers because my attorney's in the back row, so I have to, and it's get ready to report earnings. So I can't tell anything more than that. Is that we are the largest, and also in federal, we're also the largest security cloud in federal with FedRAMP. So we know a little bit about securing. We know a little bit about securing the cloud, and we know a little bit about how important FedRAMP and the modernization of this program and the modernization of making sure it's easier to get. It's been a charter of mine for a long time. It's also a big charter of ADI. So I hope today will help you guys understand a little bit more about what we do at ADI and how we'll be help ISVs, as Troy said, and others become successful in this program. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Ross, because I want to get to things that really matter. So again, thank you from ADI for being here, and I hope you get a lot out of this event today.
Thank you very much. All right, let's jump into it. I know we've got some folks who are on the line right now who want to get started in the conversation. So we'll wait till we have Eric up on the screen, and then we can dig in. Eric, can you hear us?
Sure can. Am I up on the screen?
There he is.
Oh,
Eric,
there we go.
thank you for joining us today. I know we talked a little bit last night. I know it's we're here. It's a pretty good sound over here. So just take your time, take it easy. But why don't we start off with you introducing yourself? so that the folks in the room get a sense of who you are, where you sit, what organization you're with.
Yeah, happy to. And yeah, as you kind of hinted at, my voice is a little weak today for whatever reason, just coughing the last few days. So thanks for allowing me to come virtually, and sorry for the weaker voice, but hopefully it's you can make me out okay. So my name's Eric Mill. I'm at the Office of Management and Budget in the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer, which is part of the management side of OMB. I joined the Biden administration at the top of 2021, and I've been working on issues relevant to the summit ever since. So if you're not familiar with OMB, which is not uncommon outside the government, Office of Management and Budget is the part of the White House that focuses on sort of internal agency management, policies and operations governing the things that are common to federal agencies and how they meet their missions. That includes cybersecurity, includes a lot of other things, identity, data, user experience, everything that goes into sort of the nuts and bolts of the federal government. So for myself, I have one of those jobs that gets into a lot of things, and I work for an organization that also gets into a lot of things. But I have a few areas of extra focus. Some of those are FedRAMP, as well as Zero Trust, I know we'll talk about today, and as well as things like digital identity, open source software security, memory safety, things like that. So I also have some experience. I was at an agency in the civil service at GSA for several years ago. Ended up working a lot on federal cybersecurity policy there, creating public vulnerability disclosure programs in the government, worked a lot with the FedRAMP program, and just in general started my career in the private sector as an engineer working on the web, and also spent a little time in Congress working on election security in the 2020 cycle. I say that because there are just one observation is there's a lot of differences between all these different bubbles, but there are a lot of similarities, and relevant to this, when it comes down to it, decision makers in all of these spaces, they do risk management, they prioritize their mission success, and figuring out how to do that safely is what this is all about.
All right, thank you. So let's jump right in. You guys have issued a lot of policies since the Biden administration got started, right? So the Zero Trust strategy, which you were instrumental in moving forward and getting out the door, as well as some of the other policies around logging or quantum safe encryption algorithms, et cetera. So can you give us a quick update on where those policies are at, right? How far along are you with implementing your Zero Trust strategy?
Sure. First, I also want to add like an intro here, and just to say that, one of the things when we talk about our Zero Trust strategy, what agencies are doing, commercial cloud providers are just critical to that, right? So the cloud ecosystem is instrumental for giving agencies tools to actually achieve those core principles of Zero Trust, like least privilege. There's lots of innovation that's happened in the space around granular permissions management. There are some sort of inherent benefits in also having, in the use of different services within an enterprise to make sure that you're not putting, you can survive the compromise of any one piece of your infrastructure or any one provider. So, we're really clear with agencies that smart and safe use of the commercial cloud is a huge part of this, right? And less visible things to their staff, like network-based cloud services under the hood, to things that are very user-facing. Right? So it has been around a year since we issued the Federal Zero Trust Strategy, which is in OMB speak is Memorandum 2209. There's been a lot happening since then. We unsurprisingly, a big part of what we have seen focus on, and what we are also focusing on heavily, is the identity space that is so central to Zero Trust. It's hard to get a lot of other things without a foundation of identity. It's also one of those areas where it is important to focus on security by design. And one theme for us is working with agencies and pushing them a little extra heavily on those places where they can improve the user experience and security at the same time, which people don't always assume is possible in our space. So, there are broader, more strategic things that we're working with agencies on, like helping, allowing employees to securely access applications from anywhere safely. Obviously, the pandemic also really accelerated that as well. So it's something we're building on. And then even down to more tactical things, like we've spent a perhaps surprising amount of time on just getting rid of outdated password rules, right? Special characters rotations, things that actually tend to backfire inside of organizations. So the identity has been a little extra focus, and we we especially want to focus on that area where it's security by design, can help people get multiple things at once.
Great. I think it's one of the things that we care deeply about is making sure that, and this is what ADI does. So I just want to this is more of a plug on what ADI does. Eric's putting out these policies and the requirements for agencies. He's talking about migrating to passwordless environments. He's talking about investing in cloud. And what we have to do as companies is make sure that we are translating what this means in real time for real security to the members of Congress that are authorizing these things, right? So we take and appropriating dollars against it. So we're taking what Eric is doing right now, and as he articulates it, we're taking it to Congress and saying, hey guys, it's important to give the agencies the money they need to meet the requirements that Eric is building and putting out the door with the agencies, right? So, all right, let's get into something that, we'll talk about in a little more detail later. In the FY23 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. So at the end of last year, Congress passed a bunch of bills. They passed a big appropriations bill, and they passed a big authorization bill, the NDAA. In that NDAA, buried in there was the FedRAMP Authorization Act. So it codified the program that hadn't been written into law before. It was just based on a memo from 2011. It's great. One of the things it does is it requires OMB to update the memo. It's got a list of things it has to cover, but it gives OMB wide range to add more to it. So question for you, Eric, what types of updates are you guys considering as part of the memo update? And then we can get into some more of that later, but let's start there.
Sure. We supported the FedRAMP Authorization Act and said as much at a public Senate roundtable that you and I and others were at. And so we were happy to see it pass in the FY23 NDAA. I think while it's a little too early to get into real specifics here, there's going to be a lot of engagement that you will see from us with industry and the public. I think it's important to emphasize how FedRAMP is first and foremost a security program, right? And it's one that is an enabling force. It enables agencies to safely use the commercial cloud. It's done a tremendous amount of good over the last decade to bring many useful commercial products into the federal government and has ultimately improved mission delivery. When FedRAMP was created back in 2011, at that time there was a particular focus on getting big infrastructure level cloud services into the federal government. And that continues to be important today. But over time, the market has evolved as well, and agency needs have expanded. And these days, we don't only see a focus on infrastructure, but also see a heavy focus on SaaS, software as a service. And obviously, I know the folks in here understand, there's a spectrum of SaaS and PaaS and IaaS, and really that whole spectrum is now rich with many things. And especially as you get more on the SaaS end of the spectrum, there of course is some of those products that are just very general purpose for enterprise operations, but they also tend to get more focused, right? You have a lot of focused SaaS products out there that are trying to do one thing well or a few things well. Right? And federal agencies are just like anybody else in that they benefit from having all of these tools in their environment to stay effective and to modernize themselves. Also, from a security perspective, right, the more federal agencies are making use of SaaS in the commercial space, then the more they're able to focus their these are big agencies in some cases, but everything is finite, right? They're better able to focus those finite cybersecurity resources on the core IT applications infrastructure that is inherently unique to their mission. And agencies are a lot more likely to focus those resources that way and use commercial cloud services when they know that the service operates a rigorous security program. And so we see the FedRAMP program as most effective at creating that comfort and helping that alignment when it approaches risk management within the federal cybersecurity framework from a perspective that's grounded in technical expertise, practical security outcomes, and a knowledge that we have the FedRAMP marketplace needs to be diverse in size, focus, include big broad things, include niche things, help agencies who have focus in particular sectors, and it needs to have everything in between. So given how rapidly the market changes, technology changes, it really makes sense to keep the shape of FedRAMP and its focus up to date, optimize, wherever industry and agencies are feeling the age of the program, at least once a decade.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on the second question, which is pushing the agencies to do real risk management. I think that's one of the key things for those who have been through the FedRAMP program. Uh, Sometimes when you're interacting with an agency customer, it's easier for them to look at FedRAMP as a compliance checkbox and say, all right, I'm going to default to the highest baseline possible, even though I haven't paid any attention to the data that's going through the system that we're talking about here. So how do we get those agencies to transition from a compliance mindset to more of a risk management mindset and focus?
Yeah, well, you're talking about the right issues, and it's something that we are trying to be attentive to, not just in the FedRAMP space, right? Like we have been, in how we've changed our FISMA metrics, in how we have structured our oversight on zero trust and other things. We are um, really trying to get agencies to focus more on the most outcome-oriented security measurements. We've really continued to push very heavily on things like vulnerability disclosure programs and sort of responsiveness to those things, as well as make sure that we are not just taking the word of our scanners at face value, but also really conducting significant red teaming on agency services and of course cloud services. So that's a thread that runs through all of our work. In the FedRAMP space, that's going to be something that we are also keeping top of mind. I mean, security and compliance, it's a lot, a lot what they say about theory and practice, right? Security and compliance are supposed to be one and the same. And in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there can be. So that's a tension that we understand and want to make sure is a little bit more explicit in how we do just run the federal government at large.
And I think that's music to our ears, right? As long as we're striking a balance where we're not creating a plethora of unnecessary requirements based on a new risk management mindset, and as long as we're really focused on what are the essential elements that we need to mitigate and manage the risks associated with each individual agency customer. Um, One of the areas I wanted to get into here, and I know that's a big area of interest for folks in the room, is the secure cloud FACA that GSA is standing up right now. So, as part of this same bill, there is a secure cloud FACA, and I apologize for not knowing, but basically, it's a body that's going to meet publicly uh, at least 3 times a year. And on that board, on that FACA committee, there's quite a few agencies, and there's 5 positions for industry. So how do you guys at OMB, this is a GSA run thing, right? How is OMB planning to participate, interact with, utilize it, especially given the conversation we just had about future policy development?
Yeah, and totally makes sense. And for this one, I'm probably not going to have a whole lot to say, Ross, because as you know, it is really GSA's thing that they are building and running here, following the law. But we're very happy that this is happening. We think this FACA is going to be a very helpful communications channel between industry and the federal government. Certainly, it hasn't been the only communications channel around over the years, but it's going to be a very helpful addition. So I've really looked at GSA for sort of how that's going to run, but we are certainly going to be closely following its recommendations, and we'll certainly be engaging with them in the appropriate way over the course of the year.
Cool. Okay. And we'll keep asking and following up. So we're talking broadly about cloud security here as well, and I think that we've seen, like I said at the top, a plethora of policies that have come out of OMB. You guys are driving in a direction. It's fairly clear. We support and applaud the approach towards zero trust. One of the areas that you and I talked about before this was a potential policy around memory safe languages and memory safety in general. Can you give us a quick update on what you're thinking about that and what we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you asking. We have been talking and thinking a lot more about memory safety recently, and it has been something we've really been looking into a lot over the last year. Memory safety, for those not familiar, right? It's excuse me, one of those under the surface issues that you could just kind of go for a long time without noticing, but once you start to look for it, you see it everywhere. And I'm sure a lot of the companies in the room have become, especially their engineering teams, have become more familiar with this as an issue, right? So we're very alert to the fact that, by various measures, a significant majority of critical vulnerabilities have this shared root cause of unsafe memory access, right? So if you're reading a vulnerability report on the CVE website or on the security press release for a company, you see phrases like buffer overflow or use after free. It's kind of arcane terminology. That's talking about unsafe memory access. And while Log4j was not a memory safety bug, Heartbleed was, and many of the security issues that you see in the news, whether they're affecting big enterprises or ransomwaring organizations close to home, or things that affect journalists abroad, all those things, they all, in a lot of cases, they stem from unsafe memory access. It's a drag on the world. And so you're starting to see very different groups like the National Security Agency and Consumer Reports, like all spending time talking and publishing things on memory safety. This is a long-term project, right? Much of the world's infrastructure is written in languages that are the most vulnerable to unsafe memory access, and even the most secure products in the world just continue to produce bugs in the space. So we're talking about not just a multi-year, but probably a multi-decade thing that the world has to work on. But we are encouraged to see organizations making progress despite this. The Linux kernel recently supported Rust, which was very heartening. And we are actively working with agencies internally to explore what steps the US government can take to help make progress and accelerate the work that people are doing to take those bites at the apple and to bend the curve on something like this that is so important.
That's great. Thank you. So look, I've got another question or two, but I know we're over time with you and you've taken a lot of your time. So I appreciate that. Do you have time for one or two audience questions?
Sure.
All right. So if anybody from the audience has a question, the two mics are up there. If not, I have more I can ask him. So. All right. Well, then I will ask you one more since we don't have any takers yet. Eric, you still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. All right. So the last question then, before we let you go and before we get to the panel here is, we're in a room with some companies that, a lot of them are currently working with government. Some of them want to work with government more than they are already. Do you have any advice that you'd give them as they engage with the public sector writ large?
Yeah, I would. And I really like what you said earlier, Ross, about, being the translator. And I think that's part of the theme of my advice too. One thing I've occasionally heard companies say is that they, basically don't expect the federal government to be an early adopter of some of their newer technologies. And so they may not even bring them up in conversation. I think that's, well, I'm not trying to say that's how all companies behave, right? But, whenever that happens, that's really unfortunate. These agencies really are demonstrably capable of employing cutting edge tech when they clearly understand how that translates into delivering better services, right? At their leadership levels, they are driven by the mission. And sometimes they just don't know what's possible or what to ask for because of the bubble that the federal government can sometimes operate in, or they might just assume it doesn't apply, right? Or maybe they've just gotten it into their heads as a buzzword, but they haven't been able to translate that to something tangible that applies to them. So my advice is really just to, when you work with agencies, just keep your imagination open, the agency's imagination open, and really do that work to draw a clear line to the value in the language of the agency's mission.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And we will definitely continue to darken your doorstep. So thank you for engaging with us, Eric.
I have no doubt. Thanks very much for inviting me, Ross.
So next up, we have Grant Dasher and Phil Stupak, who have graciously agreed to join us today. So if you guys come on stage, and then so you guys don't have to hear me ask questions all day, a senior advisor to ADI, Grant Schneider, is going to come and moderate that particular panel. So Grant, come on up, grab a mic, and before we get started, Grant, I know you're moderating, but if you could give a quick background, your quick background, and then you can jump into it.
There? Yes? Okay. Always that pause. Thanks, Ross, and thanks everyone for being here. Super happy to have you all, and really appreciate you taking the time today. I'm Grant Schneider. Yes, we have two Grants on a panel. It's rare, but we try to do that occasionally. And I've been supporting ADI for about the last 6 months, and I've been with a company Venable for 2.5 years. Before that, I spent 29 years in government. I worked with Eric when he was over at GSA. I was at the Office of Management and Budget. I was most recently the Federal Chief Information Security Officer, and I was on the National Security Council staff, and I did some stuff with DoD for a long time before that. So I kind of understand how government works, or sometimes how it doesn't work, and really excited to be here today. So thank you to Phil and Grant Dasher for being here with us. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you taking the time. I want to start with just, if you guys can go ahead and introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your organizations. Phil is from the Office of the National Cyber Director, and Grant is from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. But if you can just talk a little bit about your roles inside those organizations and kind of the role of that organization in this space, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. Good, that's on. Phil Stupak. So I have the typical background for someone from DC. I'm an attorney. I'm sorry. Uh, although I'm a political appointee, so I have worked in the Obama administration. I am back for the Biden administration. Between those two administrations, I live local here, where I worked with tech companies who are trying to understand the federal government. So I actually understand how you feel in your shoes today, trying to understand this huge bureaucracy on the East Coast. How do you intersect with it? How do you work with it? So I understand where you're coming from. Within my role today, I am the Director of Federal Cybersecurity at the Office of the National Cyber Director. Whole lot of words. We are the newest office within the Office of the President. So you don't create a new office within the Executive Office of the President every day. The last time the White House did this, I think, was in 1990. Our office was put into code by the U.S. Congress in December 2020. We received our very first director, was nominated in April 2021, confirmed a month later, and he shows up August 2021, and he is a team of one with no actual office, no budget. Today, we are an office of nearly 100 people within the White House. We have a very robust budget. We have 4 lines of effort. Mine, federal cybersecurity, is one of them. Our office is to harmonize and build coherence among all the various federal agencies and departments on how they approach their internal security. So that's what we're working on. And I think maybe pass over to Grant for his background.
Yeah, so I'm Grant Dasher. I am not an attorney. I am a software engineer. I worked at Google for a number of years before my time in the government, but in this role, I've been in the government now for about 18 months. I had previous tenure in the government before that, career side, not as a political appointee. And I am the senior advisor to the technical director for cybersecurity at CISA. And so in that role, I work closely with our team to try and support CISA internal mission activities. And I can talk a little bit about what CISA's mission is in the course of this conversation, but also work closely with OMB and ONCD on the broader agency side of this. One of CISA's missions is a federal civilian agency, cybersecurity, and so we work closely with OMB and now with ONCD on civilian agencies and helping them improve their cybersecurity. Zero trust has been an element of that. Historically, you probably know CISA and its predecessors for the TIC and the NCPS, which I'm sure everyone in here loves. And CDM program, which I actually think probably everyone in here loves. In various ways. So I think, but CISA's mission is a lot broader, and as it's been spun up as an agency in the last 4 years, we've really started to try and take a whole of country look at this and figure out how can we drive a more secure and safer technology ecosystem in general, not just focused narrowly on civilian agency cybersecurity, but in general work closely with our partners in the technology manufacturing community, as well as in the critical infrastructure communities to figure out how we can work collaboratively to build a model of sustainable cybersecurity, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, thank you both. And Grant, I actually want to pick up on your last comment because we're talking about cloud security here today, and we're very focused on government and government approaches. But but you mentioned this isn't just about government. Security isn't isolated, right? The security of the nation, the security of our private sector, critical infrastructure, and government all come together. And so how do, and this is for each of you because you've spent time in government and out of government, how do you see movement to cloud enhancing security for various organizations, both public sector, private sector, nonprofit, wherever they may be?
Yeah, I can take that first, and then Phil can jump in. So, look, I mean, I think cloud is really interesting, and I think at CISA we think a very important and powerful element of improving the security of the nation, and I think part of that is because it's a shared responsibility model. um, there's an opportunity for CSPs to leverage their scale and address some of the challenges with workforce and operational maturity in running software. They can just do it at a scale and do a lot of that for their customers, and we think that's extremely powerful. Now, obviously, cloud sometimes it's seen as like a magic different thing. It is really just someone else's computer, and it's important to understand that with that shared responsibility model and risk transfer also comes, you know, obligations on the part of the CSPs because they are now huge targets, right? Them being compromised has a much larger blast radius than any individual small organization out there. And we've seen that, for example, with adversary activity targeting MSPs that CISA has spoken about in the last year. But in general, we think that by up leveling cybersecurity, um, where more of the security can be sort of part of the platform, and this is especially true in SaaS, where SaaS done right, provides an opportunity for really easy to use, secure by default software that can enable organizations to, uh, achieve their missions, but do it at a much lower operational cost while still having a secure outcome, and in fact having a more secure outcome than would otherwise be possible. So in general, we think there's certain trade-offs that you have to make when you move into cloud, and it's critically important that the CSPs invest in providing that secure platform. And I think across the market, that's not universally true. Not everyone does that, but I think that at a theoretical level, that ability to leverage economies of scale is very powerful and is something that we think, especially for small and medium organizations, of which there are a lot in the government, it's an incredibly powerful tool. So that's what I would say on that.
I spent last week in Germany where I was at the Munich Security Conference ahead of the 1 year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm also come from a national security background. Perhaps both those statements will be obvious on what I'm going to say about cloud. But when you look at Ukraine, we see a test case in which a cloud has largely enabled the country to still be standing. Right. We used to think of conflict in terms of air warfare, air superiority. Now we're thinking about more inside of the context of information superiority. The ability to shift the local data holdings for the Ukrainian government to the cloud means that they maintain information superiority. It means that President Zelensky is able to continue communicating with the public, with the world, because of this capability, this technology. It's not a panacea. It will not solve everything. But what we are seeing is the ability of public cloud to maintain the security of an organization far better than when we were doing data center consolidation, right? When you have a single data center that might become a victim to a power outage in a warfare situation, kinetic effects, you have greater reliability, greater security when you migrate to the cloud. We are thinking about this also internally, using this use case from Ukraine as how do we better improve security for those small and medium-sized agencies that Grant was just talking about? How do I ensure that an agency of 5 people actually has the security they need? It is not by telling every single one of those users, check a link before you click on it, right? Instead is lifting and shifting the responsibility from individuals to those who can best bear down the risk, and that is a CSP. Right. So we are using CSPs more and more within our strategy on how do we defend the federal enterprise. It is by having those who are best positioned to defend against incoming attacks in a position so that they can defend against those incoming attacks. And for that, cloud is critical. It is absolutely instrumental to what we are trying to accomplish.
No, thanks. That's super helpful, and I want to tie it also because we talk about the security capabilities that moving to the cloud brings, and that there are certain things that are built in. Some you still have to turn on, but there are at least the capabilities are there for customers. But there's also, and this administration has been very focused on their first executive order around cybersecurity 14028, for those of you that speak Washington numbers, on software security. And so the security of the software itself, whether that's cloud software at an infrastructure level or riding on it, or even on-prem software. And so can you talk a little bit about how are you seeing organizations and industry, adopt and leverage NIST secure software development framework, how you see that applying to, to cloud software, both at an infrastructure level as well as at a SaaS level?
All right. So let me think about. So I think about this in the international context. Again, I keep talking about the international context. I was in Singapore back in October. We were talking to their internal government agencies that defend their networks, and they told something very interesting. They said, "Well, we look at various technologies that we might consider putting in the cloud, and if it's FedRAMP certified, that's good enough for us." That was an eye-opening experience. I think I just said that, and not enough people here, their heads did not explode. But really thinking about this, that if something is FedRAMP certified, that's good enough for other countries around the world. This is fascinating to me because it says that although we do not have an official standard, we do not have regulatory harmonization among nations, we are starting to see nations consolidate around the idea of if someone has gone through the gauntlet of FedRAMP certification, that's good enough for them. So I think that's really interesting. That's something that we're beginning to see. On the software development side, similarly, we are seeing a number of nations. UK is actually very advanced on this, working with our government on how do you create a more secure software development platform. I can't get too far into that, only because I don't want to get ahead of a couple of other teams on inside of our office. Maybe I'll go over to you, Grant.
Yeah, sure. So I think, um, so I used the word technology manufacturer earlier for a reason, right? That's not necessarily how companies here would think of themselves, but I think the analogy is maybe better than you give it credit for, which is that, we are creating products and services which are being consumed by government agencies, companies in the private sector, critical infrastructure operators, et cetera. And, from our view at where we sit at CISA, the quality of those products is really important, right? And I would hope that every company thinks that the quality of its products is really important and it's a key differentiator, and product excellence and product quality are widely taught concepts in business school and things like that. But for whatever reason, cybersecurity is often not thought of as an element of product quality. It's thought of as a compliance obligation. It's thought of as a function for the CISO. It's thought of as a cost center. It's thought of as a lot of things that's not necessarily a core element of product quality. And I think that, part of what we're trying to get at with these initiatives around secure software development, like, for example, the SSDF, which frankly is codifying practices that organizations like Google have been doing for well over a decade in many cases, is that, this process of engineering software, of developing and manufacturing services, whether cloud services or even on-prem services, the decisions that go into that process have lots of downstream implications on the security. And so there's a reason why some vendors who will not be named are sometimes, more likely to show up in security incidents. And some of that is just they're more likely to be used in the economy, and some of that is around the way in which that software actually gets engineered and built. And so one of the reasons why the administration has really leaned into that, and we've seen uptake and we've seen organizations adopting it, is because we feel that we need to change elements of how that's done. And we want to do that very collaboratively with industry. We want to do that in a way that isn't just imposing more costs and more obligations on people. All tools are imperfect, et cetera, right? But we do think that fundamentally the development and engineering of software such that it is fundamentally more secure and not secured by bolting on additional technology is a key element of this model of sustainable cybersecurity that I talked about at the top. And so this is a piece of that. The memory safety discussion that Eric flagged is a piece of that. This partnership, this discussion about shifting responsibility onto CSPs because they're better suited to defend their infrastructure at scale is a part of that. All of this is around burden management, and engineering secure software is the foundational element of that, which is why there's been so much investment in it. And we're eager to see how that this community of innovative companies can help participate in going after that problem.
So we are going to get to audience questions, so please think about questions. In the meantime, I've got a number of additional ones, and I want to bring in, because Grant, talking about the foundations and the foundation level from a security, Eric mentioned the zero trust strategy that OMB put out, and CISA's got a zero trust architecture, DoD's got a zero trust strategy. It has certainly been the buzzword for a while in cybersecurity, but for some really good reasons, right? Because it amplifies that get to the foundation and understand what you have in your environment, where are the things that really matter in your environment, and what are the steps that you're taking. So how are you seeing within agencies, within the public sector, this movement towards zero trust architectures, zero trust implementation? How is that interacting with their movement to the cloud? Are those things that are happening collaboratively together, or is it viewed as, I have to do one and then I can get to the next?
Obviously I think it varies agency to agency. I mean, the reality is, what is a zero trust architecture is much easier to do leveraging cloud technologies, because, there hasn't been as much of an investment by industry on developing on-premise equivalents of that. And for part of the reason that I'm talking about, which is that actually doing it well requires a certain amount of investment at infrastructure at scale that's only really economical if it's done in the context of a CSP. And so I think the two are tied at the hip. I think there's a lot of agencies that are early in their cloud transition that wish that wasn't true, that wish they could just install a zero trust box and call it a day. That's not how we see this, and we want to make sure that that they do work in parallel, and we think that there's just a lot of details where, in order to do what we're really trying to do, you have to have your IT at a certain maturity and modernization point that's really tied up in a cloud transition. And that's true in identity, it's true in asset management, it's true in networking, especially. And I think that, so I think, the agencies that are doing this well, both, on the defense side and on the civilian side, are treating them together. And you see, it's not, I'm not saying it's impossible to do zero trust without cloud. I mean, there are organizations in the private sector that have built it themselves, engineered it themselves for themselves, and not by leveraging public cloud services. And certainly parts of the government are capable of doing the same and may well do that. But in general, for the median agency, I think the two are very tied.
Anything to add, Phil?
Perhaps no, but well, yeah.
No, it's
So
okay.
I think one of the things that we are seeing is when we're looking at zero trust models, and there's largely two overall models. There's one from OMB that has 5 pillars. There's one from DoD that has 7 pillars, but really they're the exact same model, because the OMB one else has 2 cross-cutting pillars. It's basically the same model, just how we're describing them are a little bit different. Is that the DoD?
We would love more consistency on this. By the way, it's something we're going to push for. But
we have talked extensively about DoD on this. Is more, I think, a marketing question than a reality.
I really do think it's a marketing question. I think at the end of the day, they're the same. And I don't quite understand why everyone gets so worked up about 7 versus 5, but
I'm reminded of the movie Something About Mary when someone says, "Well, I have the 8-minute abs, and I created 7-minute abs." It's really the same thing. You like that reference to a very topical 30-year-old movie. But when we're looking at DoD and we're looking at how they're trying to implement their zero trust model, you cannot remove it from the cloud. It is completely tied into the cloud and on a secure cloud that they're attempting to build. They're working closely with NSA's Dreamscape, which is their unclassified systems that they can work with various cloud providers to plug into their secure zero trust cloud to see how these technologies work, because they're still at the learning point here. So I would say that yes, Grant is absolutely right that we could architect a non-cloud solution to get to zero trust. I have yet to see it. And probably the most advanced actors within the space are all completely tying in their zero trust strategies to the cloud.
No, thank you, and appreciate that. And I think part of to the 5 versus 7. I mean, but part of it is that we may all understand and be able to see the similarities. A contracting officer might not be able to, and so when it comes to how companies are going to interact with various parts of the government and parts of, from an international standpoint, part with all their customers and consumers, consistency is really, really helpful. And one of the things, and I want to talk, ask you to talk a little bit about standards. And when you look at whether it's in zero trust, Grant, for you, definitely from a FIDO standpoint around identity management, but the more we can see, governments leveraging, and the U.S. government being a driver of this, to your point, Phil, about, FedRAMP was good enough for some partners. That's great. But how do we also link back to appropriate standards so that industry can be building solutions once that are going to be able to be used in a lot of different places?
Yeah, let me offer some thoughts on this. So first of all, look, I think standards are really important. I think they're critical. I think that one of the reasons why the internet was successful was that it was built on top of a set of open standards that allowed for vendors to interoperate with each other. And we saw the growth of a number of, very large and successful companies whose routers could talk to each other because they implemented the same protocols. We haven't seen that in cloud to date. And in particular in the context of zero trust. There are specific cases, like, for example, FIDO, which we think are very interesting. Now, as a lot of you probably know, the government has its own whole set of standards around identity, in PIV and all of that. And there's been some policy that's come out of OMB to try and, start to open up the question of how to harmonize these. We think that's important. I think long term, we have to figure out how to cross-pollinate between the identity community around the government, which includes the contractors that support the agencies, not just the government itself, and the broader commercial IT and identity community. So I think there's a lot of truth to that in that context. But I think it's a bigger piece than that. And we would be eager, to be honest with you, for opportunities floated by companies in this room around standards in this space in general. So for example, logging is a classic example, right? Where there's an entire industry of companies that exist to normalize log data from different sources and then build value-added analysis and AI and analytical capabilities on top of that. Now, obviously, the value-added AI and analytical capabilities are critical. We want innovation. We want people to do that. But each company having to build their own data model for representing the other vendor's logs and then maintain their own parsers for transforming their logs, and all of this feels like a ripe opportunity for standards. And so we'd really appreciate and be very happy to partner with organizations that are interested in getting after that standards problem and other problems around interoperability of this technology, because we think that for zero trust in particular, it's going to work if it's interoperable and if people can, have a marketplace of technologies that they can use to meet their needs. So that's what I would say on technical standards. Just briefly on the regulatory standards side, look, I think it's important. I think regulatory harmonization is important because, the 10% difference at the margins can cause all sorts of issues. For example, settings and switches in the products that very few people use, that slow down delivery, that create rope by which admins who don't understand things can hang themselves, that impede business opportunities and ability to leverage innovative technology. So I think that's all very true. Now, as everyone here knows, it's also very hard, right? Because it's very much a multi-party ecosystem, even within the government. There's lots of different, points of view and things that have to be aligned. But I think in general, like FedRAMP, I think has been greatly successful in bringing a baseline level of harmonization there. And I think, going forward as it evolves, that's also an important piece. And we certainly, I know everyone will continue to point out places where we get it wrong. And I think we work through those. And that's sort of how this all has to work.
Good news on standards. About 96 hours ago, I really don't know where I am in time and space. I was meeting with ISO. And ISO said, we are not very good at creating standards when it comes to cybersecurity management, cloud practices, emerging technology topics. But they said they are trying to engage upon a cultural shift so that they do start addressing some of these items. And it begins with people who are concerned about this, people who are concerned about creating these operational standards, talking to our US membership on that body and pushing for the driving of new standards. So I think there is an interest in ISO, for example, in creating perhaps some new standards here. And we certainly would welcome it from the federal government. The last thing that we like to do when we're in government is bet on Betamax or VHS. I don't know. Can everyone agree on what that standard should be so that we can be sure that we bet upon the appropriate one? And then I think there's also an interesting thing that is beginning to occur around operational standards. I'm glad that we have regulatory standards. I'm glad that we have operational standards here. But what we also need, I think I just said operations one too many times, but we have to have the people who are actually implementing these things following similar standards. And the reason I say this is FedRAMP is fabulous. It takes a little too long. We need to speed that up. And one of the reasons for that is the auditing process. So if all nations around the world are concerned about the exact same threat, can we find ways that we can speed up the auditing or share the auditing burden among those who are in a similar position to us? So if someone is FedRAMP certified, maybe that doesn't get you into Singapore or Australia, but maybe that gets you 90% of the way there, right? So we're starting to think through with other nations, what are those shared buckets of concern that if you have a trusted partner who has already said that you're good here, how do we accelerate you within this process? That's not something you're going to see next year or the year after, probably within the next decade, but we are looking at this. We're beginning to think through this problem on how do we harmonize the implementers and what they are actually doing on these regulatory issues.
Thanks. Any questions from, yeah.
The CEO of Sunstone Secure. We are an advisory firm that help organizations get, say, FedRAMP compliant and then run them through the process and keep them compliant. We focus on cloud native and Kubernetes. And getting them assessment ready is not the issue, especially with Google Cloud, for example. We get them through in 30 days. The problem is when our clients get to an agency, especially the smaller ones, and ask to be sponsored, they say, great, when you're FedRAMPed, we'll buy. So Grant, you're in a new organization and a smaller agency. How would you go about buying from companies who want to get, as I said, need FedRAMP, and your organization probably don't have that infrastructure in place? So how can you help to get that part? That is the biggest obstacle for almost all of our clients.
The absolute best thing about my office is I have zero procurement authority. So I don't know is the answer, but maybe I'll ask Grant if you have some tips. That's why I spoke first.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, right? And I think you should ask the question again when the FedRAMP PMO is up here later. What I would say is, w- is it really the right model for small agencies to be sponsoring an organization that, as their first foray into the government? Maybe in some particular use cases that could make sense. I think it depends on the nature of the capability, whether it's a enterprise service that should be something that's provided more broadly, or is it a niche capability that's, for a particular mission of that agency. And I think, um, it's an interesting question about in that latter case where this probably does make sense, how to think through the risk management and is there a way to, create some kind of a pathway because the burden of sponsoring a FedRAMP package on that agency is not insignificant, right? They have to, be responsible for all the continuous monitoring stuff that comes back afterwards and push that through. And so there's an understandable reason why a small agency wouldn't want to do that. So I think there's an interesting question to think through there about, is there a model that would work better for these, applications that are tailored at particular agency mission sets. I think for a lot of the more generic enterprise IT capabilities, shared services models where they're consuming them off of a big agency who's managing a lot of this for them, or other kinds of models, is kind of where we're investing in supporting the small. So I think it depends on the use case, but I would encourage you to ask the question again later.
Yeah, and this is something that ADI is very focused on. How do we illuminate? Because, and I agree with Grant, there are some smaller agencies that it might not make sense for. There's also some really big agencies who have, practices, maybe not policies, but practices that they don't want to do this. And so it needs to be less of a burden, right? In my opinion, we need to find a way to lessen the burden without compromising the security. And how do we, expose a little more of who is stepping up and doing this and who is not, and maybe a bit of a scorecard on that. We've got a couple minutes left for, yeah, absolutely.
So first of all, gentlemen, thanks so much for being here. This has been awesome. So we're talking about something relatively complex compared to, say, the digitization of paper records, which just had to extend by 18 months, the deadline for that. I'm wondering if there's a way for you to characterize broadly what's causing delays. I'm sure if we're having trouble getting to digitized records, we're going to have trouble getting to zero trust and secure software development pipelines. Is there a way that you can characterize what's causing the agencies to move slowly in a way that solution providers and technology providers might be able to influence, help, add expertise? Thanks.
So, look, at a high level, working in the government is very unlike working even in a large corporation. It's an incredibly multi-party space. And so I think, some of the challenges are just the way that the federal budget process works, right? Where you're, spending money on things that you plan to do over 2 years before, for example. So that's a huge piece of this. Some of it is a workforce challenge, right? Inside of the government and the contractors that support the government, having the right staff to do these kind of transitions and who have an understanding both of what they're moving off of and what they're moving onto. And that's a pretty unique skill set to have that's hard to find. Some of it is a priorities issue. And there's sometimes in the government is perceived as a very political entity because there's elections and there's, political appointees and speeches, and the press writes about the government in a very particular way, at least the mainstream press does, not necessarily the trade press that's focused on the business of the government, which has a very different lens. But underneath all of that is this vast organization of civil servants that is doing, the missions of these agencies. And they have a lot of operational constraints that they're working under, from a procurement side, from an ethics side, from a compliance side, from a mission success side, and it's just a very multi-party ecosystem. So, in terms of things that I think are, easy to go after for accelerants, in some cases it's about procurement policy and purchasing power and the way that oversight of the budgets of these agencies works and the way that IT is treated versus certain other elements of the budgeting. I think that's an area where, continued innovation could take place. I think part of it is about, workforce and the support that these agencies get in order to execute this. Some of it is about cost, right? In some cases, cloud is a lot more expensive, not always, but sometimes, or at least less predictable what the costs are. I think there's a number of factors, some of which are unique to the government, some of which are not. That's what I would say.
I think it all comes down to budget. I mean, the budget process in the federal government is difficult. I guess I'm being recorded. Difficult. We'll go with difficult. So it's a budgeting issue, right? When you have an agency whose core mission is to maintain the security of the drug supply within the United States, to make sure that the milk that your kids drink is safe, that is where they're spending their money. Right. Now you're also asking them to digitize all their records. Okay, I can do both those, but if I do not have funds for both, guess which mission is getting shortchanged, right? Every single time it comes down to that budget issue. And because the budget issue takes 2 to 3 years to do something new, that greatly delays how long we're doing things, right? The zero trust strategy is a year old. We're ideally seeing new dollars coming this next fiscal year. Right. So even when we make pivots on huge priorities for us internally, it takes years to see the funds start catching up to that. So I would suggest that's likely the budget issue, although I've not looked at that specific topic.
Yeah, neither have I at that specific case, but that's usually
it's always the driver. I want to, in 10 seconds, Phil, we're over time, but national cyber strategy, can you tell us anything when we're going to see it? We've been reading about it for a long time.
Yes.
We're going to have one someday.
There will be a strategy.
There will be a strategy. And what I can tell you is that we have built a purposeful strategy that I think is radically different. I think it is, in fact, people say this all the time, but I think it's true that it is a paradigm shift from what you're used to seeing. When will you see it? We are now saying days to weeks as opposed to weeks to months. It has proceeded through the interagency clearance process. The cabinet has signed off. And so we're waiting on one more signature. I won't tell you whose that is, but we're waiting on one more signature. And when we have that, you will see publicly the national cyber strategy being released.
Great. Thank you very much. So if you could just join me in thanking our panelists, really appreciate it, Phil and Grant. Thanks for taking the time.
All right, guys. So we are going to keep plowing through. I do want to point out that I'm not inhuman, and I understand that we have needs. So the door's right there. Please feel free to get up and go back and forth, do what you got to do. But we want to continue the conversation. So thank you to Phil and to Grant very much for that. That was wonderful. And we are going to continue, like I said to Eric, we're going to continue to work with you guys as much as possible to help, again, move some of the things that you guys are putting into policy and putting into practice forward and being your advocates, right? We think you're doing good work. So we're going to help you from an industry perspective, make sure that there are dollars to do exactly what we're talking about. All right. Next we have Lee. There you are. Come on up. I promise I'll sit for this one. So you just grab a seat wherever. And then on either screen, we're going to have our friends from the FedRAMP PMO, as well as Dave Zvenich, who is the former director of TTS. And I'll let Dave explain kind of what his role was. Now he's advisor to me personally, and then as well as some other companies. So we'll start with Dave, and then we'll turn it over to Brian Conrad, and then Lee, I'll ask you to do the same.
Hey everyone, just doing a mic check. I assume you can hear me. You can't hear me. Hold on one second. That was the fear.
There we go.
Let's do it
we got you.
way. Doing it with the headphones wasn't going to work. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be with y'all. So just to give you a quick intro, I'm Dave Z. My pronouns are he, him. And as Ross mentioned, I'm the former director of the Technology Transformation Services. And you probably have no idea what the Technology Transformation Services are. The reason that's significant for today's conversation is that it houses the FedRAMP PMO. It also houses a number of other programs that are of interest to many of you. Programs like the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, programs like 18F and the TTS Centers of Excellence in the U.S. Digital Core. It also has programs like cloud.gov. And one of the things that's a bit interesting about cloud.gov is that cloud.gov went through the FedRAMP process. And so you have a platform as a service that had the experience of going through the JAB authorization process. Has programs like login.gov, as well as other things like USA.gov, digital.gov, the US Web Design Systems, and many, many more. So it is a broad sweep. I had joined the administration in January of 2021 and left in September of 2022. And since then, I've been doing some advising and consulting, as Ross mentioned. I've also been doing some writing. So if you ever decide to laugh on the internet about government contracting, I've got to plug my newsletter. It's govcontractually.com. It is free. It is silly, and it is about government contracting. So, buyer beware. And the last thing that I'll say is that I have a background in technology, in law, in procurement, security, and yet the real experts are the ones that are going to be speaking next. So great to be with y'all.
Thank you, Dave. Brian, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, Dave. It's great to see you again. I have been seeing your posts on LinkedIn, and when I have a few minutes to catch up, I take a read, and very entertaining, very informative. Thank you. Great to be here. Brian Connor, I'm the acting director of the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, better known as FedRAMP. As Dave mentioned, we do reside inside the Technology Transformation Service in FAS in GSA. I've been the acting director for over 2 years at this point. I joined the FedRAMP PMO in December of 2018. If anybody can recall what was happening in December of 2018, it was in the middle of a shutdown. And so I was very fortunate to be able to swear into my government service, 3 days into a government shutdown. But I joined the PMO then as the cybersecurity program manager. And that's a fancy way of saying that I manage everything that happens in the JAB lane, the Joint Authorization Board lane with regards to the PMO. And again, for the past over 2 years, doing the acting director bit as well. I joined government after a 20-year stint in the United States Marine Corps and 7 years with Booz Allen Hamilton doing IT and cybersecurity consulting. And great to be here. Thank you for having me.
That's great. Lee?
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Leah McGrath, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director for StateRAMP. My background is more in state and local government. So we're sitting here in Silicon Valley talking to people from DC, and I think I'm representing everyone else in between. My experience prior to coming to StateRAMP, most recently had served as deputy mayor for the city of Fishers, Indiana. It's a city of about 100,000 people. And whether I was working in the state or in the city, I often found myself involved in what we called modernization projects and felt the pain of trying to implement new technologies and trying to meet our citizens where they are, while also balancing that responsibility of protecting the data and the integrity of the government that we serve and the people that we served. So as by chance had the opportunity to be a part of facilitating the steering committee in 2020 for StateRAMP, what became known as StateRAMP. It was from that experience I was able to launch into serving as the executive director, and it's just sort of a dream job to be able to bring solutions to people that I know and had worked with, but also hopefully to the provider community as we try to standardize this a little bit.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna ask our panelists kind of take about 30 to 45 seconds for this next one, because it could go on for a long time. What we want to do here is kind of break down what these programs are in reality, right? They mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Somebody says FedRAMP, they have one reaction. If you're a government customer, you have another reaction. If you say StateRAMP to a state, etc. So let's start. Brian, we'll start with you. Leah, then you, and Dave, if you want to add some spice on top of it, would love your opinion as well. What are the federal and state risk and authorization management programs in reality? Brian?
So in reality, what FedRAMP provides is a standardized framework for security and risk assessment for commercial cloud services. The value proposition of the program is, let me back up. 11 or 12 years ago. When cloud was first starting to happen, cloud providers were having to go to each individual agency and go through their individual agency authorization processes. Just on the surface, you can see that that's not very efficient. And so, what was born out of a great idea became FedRAMP. So now that there's a standardized approach to assessing cloud services on the way that they protect federal information, and the value proposition is that those authorizations can be reused by any agency across the government, saving time and resources. Agencies don't have to do a full assessment. They can pick up that FedRAMP authorized package and continue to march and get capabilities into their environment more quickly than they could traditionally.
Right. Leah?
Okay, so StateRAMP, I was, listening to you describe the alliance, and I was thinking we are a 501c6 membership organization. We're basically a consortium of state and local government leaders, but also private sector. So we've got memberships across public and private sector, and really we're formed to try to create that standardized approach to verifying cloud security for states and local governments and those public agencies who are not federal, basically all the non-federal. And in doing so, have brought together just some tremendous leaders who have adopted those baseline security requirements. And I like to say we're modeled in part after FedRAMP, because we are trying to serve, really design this to serve states and local governments. And so our value prop is really similar with a few differences in that, we're trying to also create a shared service for states and local governments so that they can benefit from the continuous monitoring, from that vetting, from that information sharing that can happen by having a centralized PMO that is doing that work. And in doing so, our hope and our goal for those government members that we're serving is to be able to shift their workload. Nobody has enough time, nobody has enough resources, and there certainly aren't enough cybersecurity professionals out there to do it. So how do we shift the workload for those states and local governments so that rather than them spending time vetting, right, and continuous monitoring, we can do that for them so they can be truly managing risk?
Dave, what do those programs mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of piggybacking off of what both Brian and I'm sorry, I'm totally blanking on your name. Leah. That's embarrassing. Well, so as Brian and Leah said, the number really is like 4,000, which is 4,000 reuses. That's 4,000 times plus that people have had to go through a process just a few times. In other words, if FedRAMP didn't exist, if StateRAMP didn't exist, every single cloud service provider would have to do that hundreds or thousands of times over. And it starts to add up. And that's not just once, it's every year you've got obligations that are coming up to have, to make sure that you're continuing to comply with the standards. And so that's really what it's about. You do it once, get it reused, and imagining having those security questionnaires 4,000 times over, and having different questionnaires coming from different agencies and different expectations, it just becomes complicated. So really streamlining it, making it one place to for the federal governments to operate it, and then at the state level and the local level, same challenge. You don't want to have to do this every single state and local government. It'd be too much of a pain.
I mean, that's good. I think we want to stay right now because I think you guys are bringing the perspective of the agency and public sector customers, which is what we're here to really hear and understand. So let me, Dave, start with you. I think earlier Eric Mill mentioned that we're seeing, when the FedRAMP program was stood up 10 plus years ago, we were moving infrastructure providers through the pipeline. That was the purpose, is to provide that base level cloud infrastructure. We're now inundated with SaaS I say inundated. We now have choice for SaaS applications that can do any number of things that agencies can dream up something that they need done, and there is possibly a SaaS application out there in the world that can help them achieve whatever their particular goal is, which is fantastic. It's a wonderful place to be. So given that shift that we see out there, what do you think the public sector, the government agencies' perspectives are on cloud adoption at this point in time? Are they, is the curve of acquisition and consumption continuing to rise dramatically? What are you seeing from a requirements and needs perspective? Dave, start with you, and
Yeah.
then Leah, and then Brian.
Great question. I mean, in some respects, the demand is outstripping the supply from a compliance perspective. And what I mean by that is, there are about, Brian, correct me if I've got this wrong, 200 something authorized products on FedRAMP. That's not nearly enough, right? Like there needs to be, in my estimation, many, many, many multiples of that. And that's been a resource challenge. It's been, a agency sponsoring. There was that mentioning earlier before. Like there are a lot of reasons why that's the case, that there are only, a couple hundred applications. But the truth is that you might have a couple hundred applications in a complicated, complicated application, right? Like you may actually need all of those underlying services in order to be running a significant system. And so there's significant demand from the agency perspective. There's significant demand from from the end user perspective. At the end of the day, like when I was in government, one of the things that used to drive me bananas is the fact that I couldn't use the same tools that I would use outside of government. And that ends up making me less effective. It makes me less efficient as a public servant. And so having more access to these services is definitely, I don't see that trend going down. I continue to see the demand side being high.
Leah?
I agree. I mean, I think that, we've also seen a shift in the last 10 to 20 years from owner operated models to, okay, we're actually going to go out to work with the private sector. And I think that's awesome. I think, it's very common that we're having conversations with providers who've got a SaaS product that they are using with states or local governments. And there's also just a maturity around understanding their cyber posture. And so we'll hop on a call and they'll say, I'm good. I'm on this, FedRAMP authorized or StateRAMP authorized platform. Here you go. And we're like, that's great, but you still have your boundary for which you've got some responsibilities. Let's talk about that. And that is a huge education need and opportunity out there. And we see it all the time. From our perspective, as a nonprofit, part of our mission is certainly education and driving toward those best practices and standards, but also we want to bring innovation faster to government. We want to make government be in a position where they can make those choices and adopt technology faster because they know the risk posture, because we've made visible that risk and they can know and make those decisions that are right for them to procure. And so one of the things that we've also launched as a result of all of those things is called the StateRAMP Security Snapshot. And that is a new assessment that we have that is really a gap analysis. It is not self-attestation. There is a level of verification involved, but it allows a provider with a product or a system that they want to bring through to be able to have a very low cost analysis done to be able to understand, hey, where am I in relation to being able to achieve StateRAMP ready? But that's also a tool that can be, or a score, if you will, that comes out with a score and an assessment that can be provided to the governments when you're saying, we're pretty darn mature, right? Like we're almost ready to become StateRAMP ready or StateRAMP authorized, whichever path they're going for. And that can help speed up that buying process as well. So I think the adoption is still growing. I can tell you the pandemic did a lot to help advance that as well. So I think there's a lot of need out there, and we've just got to find a way to bring more of these products to government quicker.
Yep. We'll talk about general cost and the ability for government to continue to support that in a second. But Brian, I want to give you a chance to talk about same thing.
Sure. When you look at the context of cloud adoption in the federal government vis-a-vis the FedRAMP program, it took 6 years for FedRAMP to authorize 100 services. A mere 2 years after that, we doubled that number. And as Dave said, we're knocking on the door literally of 300 services authorized in the marketplace. And again, it's not just the initial authorization, it's the reuse. In FedRAMP, we count reuse as, a subsequent ATO from an agency who's accepted risk on that software as a service or whatever it may be, but also the times that the infrastructures and platforms are leveraged. And so that number is indicative of how much, for instance, software as a service is coming into the marketplace. We're up to over 5,200 instances of reuse with the program, and it climbs every week. And so, seeing the numbers in context to the adoption of technology across the government is indicative of that, that trend up. I don't foresee it slowing down. I can look at the pipeline of systems that I have in the FedRAMP market, or in the pipeline for FedRAMP authorization, and agencies are still pursuing this at a very rapid rate. Some of the things that have been mentioned about limitations on, agency partnership and cost, time to authorization. Those are forefront to our mind, especially when we're looking strategically at how to pick up the pace to get cloud providers into the FedRAMP marketplace.
Okay. So because we've kind of got a wide variety of experience of the panel, I want to ask two kind of bigger questions and then open it up to you guys to ask questions. Right? We want you guys to dig in here. So, question one, Brian. Let's talk about reciprocity in general. Right? So we have seen over the years, and I think for those who are paying attention to some of the outputs recently from government, DoD last week. I believe it was their inspector general just published a audit of how folks are leveraging FedRAMP and IL authorizations, and how they're reviewing paperwork. The idea that an IL2, so for those who are not familiar, the DoD's cloud security risk guide has impact level assessments, and the IL2, which is the lowest one, maps directly to the FedRAMP moderate baseline. And if you have a FedRAMP moderate, you have IL2. That's how it works. So we appreciate the reciprocity that started, but given the opportunity to reshape the memo, and given the opportunity to really rethink how these programs interact, where is your head at, Brian? We'll start with you on reciprocity, and then Lee, I'd love to hear kind of how you're approaching it, and then Dave, would love to hear your thoughts about what the art of the possible looks like.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that question. And so, we want to harmonize where we can across the government, but we also understand that each agency is going to have unique requirements that they need to address. I would enjoy I would look forward to having the conversation with DoD to see what we can do to kind of press the edge on where we are now. With regards to reciprocity. But I think something else that we need to consider when we talk about reciprocity is, some work that we did a little bit of in the FedRAMP PMO, but I want to expand as a strategic initiative, is looking at other security and compliance regimes to gauge the maturity of cloud providers who want to come and work with the government. There is a laundry list of compliance and security mechanisms and regimes that cloud providers have to go through to work with in the civilian world, in the non-federal world. And so what I'm interested in is looking at, not just reciprocity across with DoD and harmonizing controls where we can, but also looking at where cloud providers are spending resources to meet, compliance and security requirements for other industries. Where can we leverage that? Where can we lighten the burden for cloud providers to get into the FedRAMP marketplace that way? Those are things that we're talking about. We haven't formulated anything formally on those yet, but those are the kinds of discussions that we're having internally and looking at the problems that we're looking to solve.
Leah, before we get to you, just to put a point on that, given that Eric Mill was talking about engaging the private sector and industry partners, there will be opportunities for us to kind of lay out what some of those other compliance and certification regimes look like, and how you can leverage some of those industry best practices. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that we were initially tasked with with the cyber the EO executive order that came out about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. But it's also something that we want to look at because again, the challenge is getting more cloud providers into the marketplace, and we hear that cost is a barrier. So in order to lower the barriers to entry into the FedRAMP marketplace without lowering the cybersecurity bar, we want to look at any avenue that's available to us to travel down in order to meet that goal.
That's great. All right, Leah, let's talk about reciprocity.
All right. And I assume so. Someone asked me this earlier. There we go. Said something about this. They said, all right, are you talking about reciprocity from FedRAMP to StateRAMP or reciprocity between states and agencies? I'm going to answer both because I imagine you care about both. So one of the things that we're working on, we have a fast track program. So if you've got a FedRAMP authorization, we have a fast track program that allows you to come through quicker. We're also working on a fast track program with High Trust, if that's something that you're familiar with, so you can leverage that certification as well to come through. And then we're really just looking at the delta, right? So how do we make sure that we're accounting for that? And so that's the answer to the FedRAMP question. In terms of the other states and local agencies, the way our process works, we have committees. We've got a board and we've got several committees. So we have a standards and technical committee, an appeals committee, and an approvals committee that all really come together. We've had a few work sessions already this year. So annually they do work sessions, and we have private sector and public sector involved in these committees. So we've got work sessions where they're reviewing annually, hey, what are our requirements? Where are the improvements? How do we make this work better? This year, we're talking about how do we incorporate Rev 5 into our baseline requirements.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by Rev 5?
Yes, NIST 853 publication Rev 5 actually came out in September of 2020. We're in the process. Our requirements, our baseline requirements for StateRAMP are based on NIST 853 Rev 4. So we're looking at Rev 5, and we have a lot of desire from some of our participating governments to look at Rev 5 for some of those expanded control families around supply chain. The question where we've kind of run into, and we're starting to have more dialogue, and this gets to that harmonization at the state and local level that you all may feel as well, is how do we address the privacy control family, right? You all probably deal with that a little bit when you are working across states who define privacy differently and who approach it differently. One of the areas where we also hear a lot of challenge in that harmonization is, and I say this because it's all related to reciprocity, I think, and how states deal with this, is those federal requirements that flow down to states and local governments, like from CJIS, Criminal Justice Information Systems, or Medicaid Management Information Systems, or IRS, to our tax administrators. All of those are federal requirements that have sort of their own flavor of frameworks that flow down. And so what we're really trying to do with Rev 5, initially what you'll see is a draft baseline that really doesn't touch privacy. But what we want to be able to do is start having those conversations with those different agencies at the federal level, and then also bringing all of our members together to say, hey, where can we drive towards standardization? That being kind of really what is important here, because that's what allows us to verify once and serve many. And so that's part of our, how we think we get there to be able to have true reciprocity between states or local entities, is to be able to bring everyone together to drive toward that standardization. Our members, we've got, I think, north of 150 provider members now. Many of you I see in the room are members, so thank you for being a member of StateRAMP. But our members will have an opportunity to review these draft baseline requirements that we're putting out next week. I think it's open for review. So take a look, let us know your thoughts, and then we'll continue to iterate from there. We're also launching a provider leadership council that is really going to be a great sounding board to be able to provide input back to us, and then also for us to kind of bounce things off of with the provider leadership council too.
That's great. All right, Dave, let me kind of set this up. So Leah brought up taking a look at reciprocity through the lens of requirements in general. So I'm curious, what's the art of the possible? I heard Eric Mills say today there's memory safety policies and requirements that could be forthcoming. We have recently seen SBOM, not SBOM, sorry, NIST Secure Software Development Framework requirements released by the Office of Management and Budget. So there are whether people want to call them compliance or not, there are things that map directly to the same control family that flow up to FedRAMP. So what in your mind is the art of the possible? And take me beyond what I just said to you too.
Yeah, I think there's what's interesting about this particular, like the question and sort of the discussion before, is that there's a really core tension that's exposed right now, and I think it's you're seeing it play out in a lot of different contexts, but it obviously the security is one of them, which is there's a tension between government compliance goals and the government's desire to broaden the industrial base. So when you're looking right now, if you pay attention to, and you shouldn't, but if you pay attention to like the Senate Armed Services and the House Armed Services Committees in Congress, and you pay attention even to DoD Small Business Programs Office, there's a lot of focus right now on how do we broaden the industrial base. The number of companies that are participating as vendors to DoD has gone down dramatically over the last several years. And that's not just true at DoD, it's in the civilian context too. There are fewer companies selling to the government today than there were years ago. And that should concern you because there are more companies today than there were a few years ago. So on one hand, the trend line goes up, and on the other line, the trend line goes down. And one of the significant causes for that trend line to go down is the fact that the government continues to add compliance requirements that make it difficult for businesses to choose to enter the government market, particularly when they can contrast it with commercial opportunities that have slower deal, like faster cycle times, lower deal costs, like just so many reasons to prefer not selling to the government. And so I think what's interesting at this particular moment is that there's a conversation being had about the DIB. There's a conversation being had about what's, I guess, called the GIB, the government industrial base. And I think what's interesting, and sort of just picking up on what Leah said, and I thought it was a really, really savvy point, is that right now what's happening is that something like a FedRAMP ready or a StateRAMP ready is actually like a proxy for the fact that like an entity is willing and able to work with government. And so like it kind of sucks, that you'd have to go through these processes in order to demonstrate some corporate maturity to the government. And yet having that corporate maturity actually helps do the other things. Like when you're dealing with other compliance issues, you're dealing with other procurement related needs, being able to do a FedRAMP process, being able to do a StateRAMP process is a signal to the government. And it's one that I think will help as you go through that, through those otherwise pretty difficult processes. Hopefully the government writ large, and this means policymakers from Congress through the executive, through state level, are going to start to recognize we can't win in our goals unless we actually work broader with industry. And I think that's something that we just need to have better conversations about.
I appreciate that. So we're gonna just give everybody a heads up. We're pivoting to cost here. So I appreciate what you're saying, Dave, and I think that the majority of the folks in the room would also appreciate that the public sector, it's both. It's a customer that is a good customer to have, and it's also a customer that people want to support because of the missions that it enables and provides. Right. So both of those are real drivers. However, it is not the only customer. It is not the only area or industry vertical that is consuming cloud at a rapid clip right now. So for a lot of people, the juice just ain't worth the squeeze. So for those companies that have not invested the cost associated with it yet, what would you tell them? How should they approach interacting with the government? And then for Leah and for Brian, what are we doing how are we rethinking the FedRAMP program to make it less of a soda straw and more of a bigger aperture that can participate in the marketplace while lowering the cost of entry? So Dave, start with you.
Yeah, I think there are two different things that I would offer. One is to think about the government as a long-term partner. One of the things that I think is important is that it is difficult, obviously, to sell to the government, but once you are working with the government, they tend to be a very reliable partner. I think so there's a fair amount of upfront investment, which again, it stinks, But if you're a large company, or if you're going to be an emerging company, like that becomes a valuable thing. If you're a Series B looking eventually to IPO, having the government as a set of logos is not a bad thing. As you start to think about having a larger market share, having a larger revenue source. That's like one part of it. But the other part of it too, and again, like not to overemphasize one way in, but I think partnership is actually a really, really big deal that people overlook. There's a tendency to think that you should go it alone when you're working with the government. Like, I'm going to do this our way. And I think there's a real lesson to be learned that other people have gone through these processes. Other people have been through the FedRAMP and StateRAMP process. They've, as companies, as individuals, and they currently want to help other people do this well. And so really like trying to broaden the aperture of just like, how can I get mine? But instead start to think about how can I work with others who have gotten theirs, actually makes it possible to reduce your costs and increase your likelihood of success. I really think that relying on the ecosystem, we heard from Zscaler, they've gone through this process, could talk to them, figure out how that process worked and what lessons they learned along the way.
So Lee and Brian, rumor has it that once we adopt OSCAL, it's game over, right? Automation is going to solve everything for us.
There usually is a, one bullet solution.
That's it, silver
I'm
bullet,
sure you're
OSCAL.
right.
So tell us, how can we reduce the cost and remove some of the barriers to entry?
We talk about this all the time, because if you are familiar with, the more local the government, the more, kind of political and noisy it can be. So we have to really care about that. And how are we being business friendly, and how are we helping with that process? I've had a lot of conversations. I'll say, first of all, you don't have to do business with a government. You don't have to have a contract already to come through StateRAMP. That was really important to our founding steering committee. We wanted to remove that barrier. You can come through. We want you to, we want to grow that pool. Secondly, I have a conversation because of that quite often with technology companies or providers, or maybe I've got a SaaS solution that can serve a niche need in government really well, but they've not done that yet. And so we'll have a conversation, and they get frustrated by, well, I have to demonstrate my security, and that's really frustrating. But the whole conversation today has been around partnerships with public and private sector, and that's how we're going to be stronger together, right? And so I typically go back to that and say, yes, we want you to bring your innovations to government, but when you do that and we're connecting, you have to recognize that, congratulations, you're now a part of the cyber defense team for the city of Fishers, Indiana, or the state of California, because we've got to do this together to be stronger. And so how you reduce the cost, some of the things that we've been doing, I'm going to mention the StateRAMP security snapshot again. It is the way to start. I think, you get that up front, you can understand, you can identify what was unknown. And that's really valuable because, I've had a lot of conversations with providers who say, well, I don't want to commit to this because I don't really know what it means. I don't know where my gaps are. If I commit and I find out I've got these massive gaps I need to lean into, that's scary for me. And so the snapshot is going to give really that very clear visibility into here's where your gaps are. And we can work together to develop a roadmap to, filling those gaps. So I think the snapshot is the way to help reduce that cost, because I've talked to so many providers who've gone through that FedRAMP journey or that StateRAMP authorized journey. And a lot of that cost is in the upfront consulting to know what the heck to do. And so if we can peel that back, if we can provide better resources through our organization so that providers don't have to do all of that upfront, we can make it a little bit simpler. We can provide that consulting on the front end. Our hope is that it becomes more doable and manageable. The other thing that we focus a lot on in our standards and technical committee and with our work sessions when we're reviewing controls is making sure that and we're actually starting a 3PAO advisory council too. That'll be announced next month. So you've heard it here first. But part of that is to be able to have those conversations around what we call intent and purpose. So if you're going to do, you need to meet these controls or these requirements, these standards, let's evaluate, are you meeting them maybe in a different way than we imagined? And that can be okay. And so providing a path to be able to help people through the process easier on the front end to be able to accomplish that.
Thank you. And Brian, given the fact that we're looking at some potential policy updates and some reimagining of how the program works, all joking aside, what are some of the ideas that are kicking about right now that you can share with us?
So I think, instead of just using the magic bullet of automation to solve the problem, we have to look at it systemically as a system. It's, getting cloud providers into the marketplace. It's getting assessments done, reducing the burden on agencies, on cloud providers, on the FedRAMP PMO to make things more efficient. But again, right now, one of the biggest challenges that we have is there's a demand signal that's required for cloud providers to get some sort of FedRAMP authorization to get into the marketplace, other than at a FedRAMP ready. And so, kind of thinking, how can we address that? Can we do some things around, the requirement of a demand signal to grow the marketplace at something more than a FedRAMP ready? That's kind of top of mind for me, because that FedRAMP ready is a it's a significant investment. There has to be the due diligence on the part of the cloud provider to make sure that they're protecting federal information in a way that it needs to, according to the standard. There's also 3PAO involvement there to assess, to do that readiness assessment. There's work on the part of the PMO to adjudicate that. And so if we can look at ways to kind of decouple the demand requirement to get into the marketplace somehow, I think that would go a long way in service to, broadening the availability of innovative technology for the federal government.
I also don't want to poo-poo automation. I do think that's going to play a big factor as well.
I think so too.
I want to open it up
very
for
excited about that, Ross.
For you guys. I mean, we've got some pretty senior folks here. Feel free to ask any questions you have. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I've got plenty more to ask. But can you introduce yourself so folks know who we're talking to?
Can you hear me? All right. My name is Kumar Selvaraj. I manage Zscaler compliance program, public and private sector. Great to see all three in the panel. In fact, great to see StateRAMP and FedRAMP coming together in the same panel. So that's phenomenal. So my question is, Leah and Brian, you talked about reciprocity from the requirement standpoint. Could you talk about reciprocity from the process of going through FedRAMP and StateRAMP? Right, the process for a CSP to go through the exercise of going through the assessment and so on, and keeping that as an efficient process. And the adjacent question to that is, I love StateRAMP. We started from like TextRAMP, ASRAMP to what CalRAMP. We avoided that. Now we're getting to StateRAMP. I think that's a great thing, right? But when it comes to sharing information with StateRAMP, end of the day, it's a private institute. It's a private organization, right? The elephant in the room is what guidances we CSPs need is, to what extent are we allowed to share the data that we get from FedRAMP authorization to be able to, because reciprocity is a double-edged sword too, right? How much can you share to be able to get the efficiency in place? So looking for some guidance there. Thank you.
Can I jump on that one first?
I always defer to the master Brian Conrad here.
You owe me a coffee for that one, but no. So okay, so I'm gonna kind of answer those in reverse order. Kumar, first of all, great to see you again. So we've wrestled with this question inside FedRAMP, and we've talked to the Joint Authorization Board about what exactly can CSPs share, what data is proprietary to the cloud provider, and when does it become federal information. And so what has come down is the SSP, the SAP and the SAR are proprietary information to the cloud provider. We have no objection with, we as in FedRAMP have no objection with the cloud provider sharing that information, as long as you let FedRAMP know who you're sharing it with. Okay. That is to facilitate, we're not holding on to, you know, Zscaler's proprietary information. That is Zscaler's system security plan. That's your secret sauce on how you're protecting federal information, how you're implementing security controls. And so that the SSP or the SSP, SAP, and SAR, and I believe I'll have to go back and check my notes later, but I believe the customer responsibility matrix can also be shared. When you start injecting federal information, or when the federal government starts getting involved with the cloud provider, for instance, on continuous monitoring reports and stuff like that, that is considered federal data, and we can't share that. But all the rest is, you know, belongs to that commercial entity, and you can share that just as long as you let FedRAMP know, hey, we're sharing our proprietary information, our SSP, we're posting it out on the internet. So just so you know, that kind of thing. I
Oh,
honestly,
well,
just
I
joking,
mean,
I wouldn't
yeah.
advise that, but you know, in order for us to have some awareness of where that information is. Did that answer your question, Kumar?
Yeah, can you answer the first part of the question from the process side of it? The reciprocity, efficiencies from going through once in FedRAMP, how can we benefit that for the StateRAMP process from your point of view?
I don't think.
Yeah.
I-
So,
Yeah.
Leah, go ahead. I'll let you run with this one.
Well, well, that's what I was just going to say. I think what you're asking is, if you have a FedRAMP authorization, how do you leverage that to come through StateRAMP? So the way that we treat that, we call that our fast track process. And so you're able to leverage the same audit, exactly what Brian was talking about, your RAR, your SAR, your SSP. So you don't have to repeat the audit. That's really the most important thing, right? We're going to recognize that. And then you're going to work with our security team, our program management office, to walk through that. If there is anything that needs to be redacted, you're going to redact that before. If there happened to be some kind of, I don't know, anything in it, right? You're going to tell our team. And when there are questions, our team has hopped on calls with different agencies to be able to answer those questions directly. So know that that's something we're always happy to do. If you're interested in that fast track program, we do have, our PMO will review that package. They're going to validate it, authenticate it, make sure it's complete. Believe it or not, we've had a few that were not. And so we're going to make sure that it's a complete package. And then it's going to go through our process. So we do, if you are going from FedRAMP authorized, you can come into StateRAMP authorized. If you're FedRAMP ready, you go to StateRAMP ready. For our authorized process, we do require also a government sponsor. It means something different in StateRAMP. If I could go back in time and advocate to call it something different, I would. But what we've got for our authorization process as a government sponsor, the way that works, we have an approvals committee, which is one of your options. We've got 5 different government leaders represented who, as a committee, will basically sign off and say, yep, we agree this meets the requirements to be StateRAMP authorized. Or if you have an agency or a state or local leader that you work with who you would like to serve as your government sponsor, they do that as well. Here's how it's different. Our PMO is going to do the heavy lifting. So our security team is going to do that validation, review it, basically have an executive summary typed up and make a recommendation for status award. And then that government sponsor or approvals committee, if they're going that route, would log in. We have a secure system that's used. Providers are the ones who always provision access. You get to decide who sees what. And then the committee would be able to review the PMO's recommendation, see the associated documentation if needed, and then make that decision to say, yep, we agree.
Other questions?
I got a thumbs up. I answered the question.
There you go. Other questions from the audience? Yep. Just go, guys, go up to the mic and start asking. We've got about, if you guys can stay on a little longer, Dave. I don't know, Brian, how long we got you, but 10 minutes or so. We've got a few more questions. Go ahead. Introduce yourself. Can you repeat that? I don't think it was live.
Nope, didn't hear.
Go ahead. Yep.
Okay. I'm Bill Crickbaum. I run the cloud platform team.
Still can't hear the question.
I'm still Bill Crickbaum. I run cloud platform at Informatica. We've been ATO'd for about a year for several of our services. The question I have, and it's not really a question, it's a request. Can you get with vertical industries, especially like the Fortune 50 companies. Dealing with like the financial institution, frankly, is like dealing with the government. I'm trying to run a single cloud, not 10 different clouds, yet I feel like I'm not just dealing with the different government agencies, the state agencies, the FedRAMP. They're killing us. What can you do to help?
Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I can take it since I'm not actually in a position to answer it. I'd like to help. But what I can say on this is, and this is actually one of the things that I think is really, from an advocacy perspective, I think there's a really good opportunity with the FACA. As I think some of the earlier panels discussed, there is going to be a federal advisory committee that's going to be created as part of the federal statute for industry to be able to speak up about the challenges that it's experiencing with the compliance system. One of the things that was really distressing, and Brian's heard me say this, and this is not something that I was shy about when I was in the government, is that we got to stop building gov clouds. Like, we cannot have a situation where every single cloud that ends up working with the government was built for the government, because then what's the point of a commercial cloud? Like, it's supposed to be having parity with the commercial investment with the government cloud. And if we're not doing it, we're doing something wrong. The government is only, $80 billion a year in total IT spend. Turns out the overall market cap and the overall market spending on technology is going to be much larger than what the government is going to be bringing to bear. And so we need to be really mindful about getting the best of commercial technologies into the space. So I think the right answer to the question is, like, don't stop advocating for having closer parity to commercial expectations from the government's perspective, because that's what it's going to need to take. The government is going to have a gravitational pull toward more and more and more and more compliance. There's some compliance requirements that are eminently reasonable. The problem is that when you start taking them in toto, like, they start to look ridiculous. And so I think one of the things that needs to happen is there needs to be better dialogue and continued dialogue between industry and government about what those standards are, how we measure them and monitor them, and how we accept risk. I mean, Ross, I kind of laughed a little bit when you mentioned the DoD-IG report, because the DoD-IG report said that there are vulnerabilities. Yeah, okay, that's true. There are vulnerabilities. Next, like, we need to be able to have conversations to say, there are things that we're going to accept from a risk perspective, and there are things that we're not going to accept from a risk perspective, and we're going to establish a compliance framework that's consistent with that expectation of risk.
Can I double on that a little bit, Dave?
Go ahead.
I think also too, one of the challenges is creating tempo, which is speed that, for instance, the government works vis-a-vis, commercial industry to make sure that, when we do significant changes, when we do initial assessments, is done at a much more rapid pace than it is, or on par with what happens in the commercial world as well. We have a lot of layers of making sure that cloud providers are doing the right thing, and we're going to assess it and make sure it's assessed again and, double and triple checked. But I'd be interested to have some conversations on how we can, kind of create some tempo to make that go a little faster. So because we understand that the commercial side is moving a lot faster, implementing changes, implementing new technology and new features and services and such. Compared to our process now, I think we can find some ways to find some efficiencies there.
That's great.
And I'd offer to be a part of those conversations as well.
Yeah,
I see some heads shaking.
A lot of people are interested in those conversations, so I think you got some takers, Brian. Martin.
Hey, Martin Rigger with Stack Armor. Thank you all for joining us today. I really just have one question, which is in 27 parts. So, Brian, it kind of is directed more a little bit at you. So we talked about reciprocity and fast track and the ability for CSPs to port that package over. A couple things that I think I was looking to try to get a little insight on is, what about the other direction? Given the nature of how StateRAMP was developed, the baselines, the controls, the leverage of the 3 PAOs, and the fact that it's an entry point for CSPs who don't have, for instance, federal agency sponsors, who may start that route and then attempt to go through FedRAMP or achieve FedRAMP later. Can you maybe give us a little insight? Is that something you guys are thinking about or working towards?
Yeah. So, when I mentioned talking about, you know, reviewing other compliance and security frameworks to look at the maturity of a cloud provider, absolutely not going to commit to saying that, this is exactly what's going to happen. But, StateRAMP is one of those things that we want to look at. If a cloud provider has achieved a StateRAMP authorization, what's the delta between that and a FedRAMP authorization? Um, I'm not saying that there's going to be reciprocity. Yeah, you got your StateRAMP, here's your FedRAMP authorization. But that is something, along the lines of all the other security and compliance regimes that we can look at to potentially, gauge a CSP's maturity and potentially get them into the marketplace quicker.
Can I add one thing? I think that goes back to the question we just had about financial services industries and what, does SOC 2 compliance fit into that as well? Like, where are the different compliance frameworks that we're adopting and taking in, right? I mean, I think that's what we want to see, and that's what we're going to continue to push for, frankly, from
Yep.
an ADI perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that there's not going to be a one for one, and I had a conversation with a CIO in government, and the thought process is if you drop all these security and compliance, regimes that a cloud provider has met on top of the FedRAMP authorization, there's some things that are going to be covered and things that we don't have to look at, that we don't have to assess as closely as we would. There's going to be some controls, obviously, that require, the testing and require the assessment as usual. But theoretically, that number should be reduced. That level of effort should be reduced in order to get them into the marketplace.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rupen. I'm a CTO at Bluescape. We got our FedRAMP Medium plus IL4 in December of last year. Couple of questions. So if we were to get the StateRAMP, did I understand that we have to have a sponsor?
So if you were to come, are you FedRAMP authorized? Is that what you said?
We are fully FedRAMP ATO certified.
Yes, ATO. Okay.
FedRAMP plus IL4.
Then the only reason I asked is because if it was FedRAMP ready, you do not have to have a sponsor. But coming through, yes, we would, and we can walk you through that when you start that process to help connect. But we would be looking for, is there a state or a local government that you work with that you would like to have be that kind of second reviewer of the package, or we have the approvals committee process. Sometimes the approvals committee can add a few weeks because that's a committee that works every month. There's a queue. So you just have to get in queue for that. And the sooner we know, the sooner we put you in line.
Do you have any estimation roughly how long it takes to get this?
From a fast track process, it takes a matter of weeks. Typically, if you are going through that approvals committee, it can add a month or two onto that, depending on just where you are in queue for the approvals committee to review. Okay. And we could tell you that after that first conversation.
Okay. My next question is a bit of a nuance.
Yes.
So that is, so we got our FedRAMP IL4 certification on the AWS GovCloud. Now, if we were to, let's say, another cloud infrastructure provider who is a Gov certified, do you have any fast track model? Let's say our system, I'm just gonna make things up. Let's say we want to put on the Google Cloud, which is a Gov Cloud. Is there any way any kind of portability exist? Or any such model? Because I researched a lot. I could not find.
No, I understand. That's a great question. There are probably some variables that we'd need to look at. That's why it's hard to answer. But what I would invite you to do, we do have PMO office hours on Wednesdays. That's something that you can attend anytime. Anyone can call in for. Or email me. It's leah@stateramp.org. So very simple. But email me and we can hop on a call to get into some of those specifics to answer your question.
Because the reason I ask is that you previously said that what can we do to reduce your cost? So in our scenarios, our system is certified on AWS GovCloud. In some other business engagement, somebody said, hey, I would like to run on the different things. We said that, we have a certification here. If there's a quick way to get this, transfer the certification to certain other GovCloud, then it reduces the cost significantly for us. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge time and money investment as well.
Where I thought you were going, because I have this question often, is they'll say, hey, I've this cloud is authorized, right? This product, I'd like to now do it. kind of replicate it, basically copy and paste it and be able to serve state and local this way. That does require a new audit. So that's where I thought you were going. So there's probably a happy medium there that we can talk about.
I want to be mindful of time because we
Thank
have
you.
one more discussion. Yeah, let's say one more question and then we'll wrap up.
There's a question for Leah. Leah, I'm Tim Woodbury. I work for Splunk.
Hi.
And a question, I used to work at a company that was a smaller technology company focused specifically on state and local government, which I think primarily, StateRAMP is trying to push. Say you look at the GovTech 100, which is an eRepublic list that is mostly technology companies focused on state and local. But if I look at the cross-reference of FedRAMP to StateRAMP, a lot of it right now is, the larger companies like a Splunk that is just easily porting its FedRAMP status over to StateRAMP. That's great. But like I think the snapshot program seems like an effort. What else do you think is important for StateRAMP to get those GovTech 100 companies into the StateRAMP program, and a timeline on that?
That's a great question. The snapshot is a huge answer to that question. So last year we spent a lot of time talking with our participating governments to understand, how do you, we called it the runway. How do you provide a runway? You can't stop business. You can't say, well, we're just going to pull the plug on all these vendors that we're working with. That's not reasonable. That's not something that can practical, right? And so what we talked a lot about was how do you develop a runway so that we're at least moving in the right direction. And what we've seen are some solicitations out there. You've probably seen them too. Arizona, Missouri, there are a couple others where they're requiring the awarded vendor to take that product through to become StateRAMP ready or authorized within a certain time frame. That gives them the runway. But what we heard from our participating governments and what we heard from providers who are looking at StateRAMP ready or authorization is, well, how do I get started? So from the government perspective, we were hearing that's great, but it doesn't help me very much in the solicitation process when I'm reviewing different providers out there to understand where are they, right? And then, and can they achieve StateRAMP ready or authorized within that time frame? And then what do I do about my current vendors? And then when we were talking to providers, the ones who are serving state and local government, it's a journey, right? It takes some time. If you've not designed or thought about cybersecurity in mind, kind of back to the earlier presentation, if you've not built cybersecurity into how you design, there's some work to be done. And so I think the snapshot is part of that answer there to help them understand what work needs to be done. The other thing we're getting ready to roll out next month is, this was a great idea that came from some members on our standards and technical committee last fall was, well, could there be like a subscription model to the snapshot? So we're getting ready to roll out the StateRAMP security snapshot kind of progressing program. I got the name of it all wrong. So just follow us at stateramp.org so you get it. But basically, it's a subscription model that comes with a monthly consulting call, basically to help advise on where you need to go, and then quarterly updates to that snapshot so that you can have that quantification, that score to say, here's where I'm going. I think it's going to take that kind of work to be able to help the provider community that serves states and locals or higher ed catch up, right, and get to that point in cyber maturity. I think the other thing that you'll see, I know the other thing you're going to see coming here in the next few quarters, you're going to start seeing solicitations that require StateRAMP security snapshot upfront. And I think when you see it required, or there's going to be an incentive for extra points awarded, right, to those who have it. When you start seeing that requirement, you start seeing that as an incentive in the solicitations, you'll see more providers coming through. So we're engaged with, I think the last I looked, we have 3,000 companies that are engaged with StateRAMP in some way. We have over 150 who've officially joined, but we're having a lot of conversations because I think, as you said, Dave, that market out there, it's very large. And actually, when you look at the state and local level, at the number of cloud products that are being utilized, it's a big number. And so we want to make sure that we're providing that service to them as well.
All right. I'm going to give each of you guys, 15 seconds to close up. So Dave, we'll start with you, Leah, and then we'll end with Brian.
Yeah, I mean, in 15 seconds, the market's not getting colder; it's getting hotter. There are people that are trying on all sides to make it easier, and it's more important than ever that people like engage in that conversation and push. That the fact that these conversations are happening and ADI is bringing it together, and and folks are talking about it is really important. So thanks for the opportunity to be joining you today. And like I said, don't go it alone. Talk to each other, work with each other. There are people who have gone through this experience.
Leah.
I love that. Get involved, get engaged. I think, we've basically celebrated our 2-year anniversary last month, and a lot has changed and evolved because of just the tremendous leadership and voices that we have. I think that, we really try to adopt this attitude of continuous improvement and continuous kind of reaching for how we do it better. And so having your voices, I just thank you very much for being a part of today's discussion, but encourage you to reach out and help us improve.
Yep. Brian.
Thank you very much, Ross, ADI, for having me here today. Great to see Dave and Leah again as well. Please consider FedRAMP as a partner. Okay. Protecting federal information we consider as a team sport, and we're in this to collaborate with cloud providers, agencies, and third-party assessors to make sure that things happen the right way, and we can help aid in the process. Can't echo strong enough the need for coordination, communication, and collaboration. So thanks again.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Kovac.
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, when I kicked it off, we are StateRAMP too. So I missed that. I owe that to you. Leah, forgive me. What I want to say to these guys, Z, good to see you. It's been a while. In the last 3 years, the kind of the paradigm shift has happened with these guys. It used to be the big bad FedRAMP, right? And it's horrible. When Dave was the head there and with working with Brian, and since he's been in the office, they are our friend, right? It is their job to get people authorized. So I think a lot of people think, they're trying to not get us authorized. You got to get your people thinking that these people are there to help. I mean, Brian has people that will help you find sponsors. Leah has the same. They help you you can bring them in for helping with your package and look at questions. Talk to them, communicate with them. Don't keep them in the dark, because they will really help you. Again, if you think about it, it's their job to get people authorized, not to block us from getting authorized. And that's a paradigm shift we had to have made the last 3 years, because originally it felt the other way. It doesn't feel that way anymore. So thank you for attending the ADI event. All three of you for attending the event. And I'll let you wrap.
Well, you're up next. So thank you guys very much for joining.
Thank you.
So again, this is the next panel will be the industry panel. It's the last panel for the session. Again, please feel free to come and go as you please, and then we'll have a light lunch afterwards. So I'd like to invite up our industry folks now for the discussion. Thank you. Alvaro, are you coming? All right. So as Alvaro gets up here. So the folks up here represent ADI members who have participated with us, who helped us put together this event, and are continuing to engage with policymakers like we just had up here. I want to kick off. We'll start with Alvaro and go down the line. Can you just introduce yourselves? Talk about what your position is in the company you're at, and how you're engaged with the broader discussion around risk management.
Sure. My name is Alvaro. I work for Google. Hey, Grant. And I basically lead the team that takes care of all the compliance certifications for Google Cloud, including FedRAMP, Bio4, 5, etc.
I'm GP. I'm the CEO and founder of Stack Armor. We specialize in solving some of the problems that we've talked about today, specifically what we call ATO acceleration. I've worked on that problem for, at this point, about 5 years, and looking forward to this conversation. So our goal really is to help reduce the time and cost of FedRAMP, FISMA, CMMC, and StateRAMP compliance. So excited to be here.
Excuse me. I introduced myself earlier, Stephen Kovac. I am our Chief Compliance Officer for Zscaler, as well as the Chairman of ADI. So I'm wearing 2 hats today. Just get going. Everybody knows me pretty much. So
Great. All right. So let's jump into it. So we've just heard from a bunch of folks in the government talking about everything from the nitty gritty authorization process all the way up to the broader cloud security. Is there anything that you want to highlight, one that stood out, or anything that was missing that we need to continue to ask about that just jumped out at you?
Well, I'll go first. You guys okay with that? There were a lot of things. I mean, I think that, we talked about being able to reciprocity. I think it needs to extend past StateRAMP. I think there's no question, and I know Alvaro, you probably do have the same issues I have. I'm spending another chunk of money to do CMMC, which is the exact same certification basically as FedRAMP, except there's a few more controls. So I think that we can push. ADI really should be pushing hard. And we will to continue to get this across not just StateRAMP and FedRAMP, but to get it across any other certifications we need in the market, in the federal marketplace. It's just tough to spend, $1 million plus, whatever you're spending on FedRAMP, and then realize you got to go do it again for a new one. It just has to be more of that. And the second thing I would say that really stood out to me was Z's comment. I know he's been making this comment for a lot of years about not having a gov cloud, just having one cloud, a commercial cloud. I salute Google. You guys have pulled that off. But in my case, in a case where you're dealing with, sensitive, not infrastructure, you start getting into SaaS. I think it's actually going the other way. I actually believe that, there are much more, the government's pulling much more away from commercial when it comes to managing data for us. The requirements they're giving us more and more are unable to achieve in the commercial space, unless you do complete segregation of your data within one cloud, which you can do that. But then the other part is the SCR process. We do in our commercial cloud, we could do 100 patches, 100 updates a day, feature updates a day. How are you going to do that in FedRAMP? So I think that's a little bit of a pipe dream, but we can continue to push to see what they mean by that.
Right. GP?
I think, Ross, thanks for this, panel. I think it's very important when we look at the situation today that we also take a look back at history, right? I did my first cloud migration in 2009. Since then, I've spent about 6 years doing cloud migrations for different, agencies, Treasury and others. And so what used to be the case in 2015, 2016, if anybody wanted to look for a FedRAMP authorization, the benchmark was, roughly 24 months and about $3 to $5 million. Today, here in 2023, I mean, I have you have two great examples. One large firm, somebody like Informatica, and a amazing company like Bluescape, who is a young up-and-coming company. And the reality is today, you can get an end-to-end FedRAMP ATO in about six to 9 months for about 1/3 the cost. So overall, I would say industry and the government and everybody working together has made tremendous amount of progress. There is more to be done, and I think conversations like this are important. But I think one important thing to not forget is the reality is commercial cybersecurity standards, particularly for SaaS, have not kept up with what is required. I mean, it's well known that we keep having these security breaches and such, and the reality is corporate investment in cyber is not at where it needs to be. And so really you're having to create these gov cloud type enclaves because you're required to meet a cybersecurity standard. But if the new national cybersecurity policy comes into bear, I think you'll see some sort of leveling of the standards. So it's a continuing conversation. But while we, look for the solution in the future, we should also look at the progress that's been made.
So let me. I want to. Before we get to you, Alvaro, you're saying that because there's been a lag from an industry investment in broad cybersecurity, are you saying that the compliance and certification schemas that exist today in broader commercial industry are not as up to snuff as needed, and therefore we've had to come in as a government and raise the boat on security?
I think that's what I see.
Okay.
Right. So I deal with different kinds of companies, hundreds of companies every day. And so, what we found, and that's the basis of our company, is, and that's why we call it ATO acceleration. The traditional advisory business was centered around, I'll come in and do a gap analysis. Well, what will the gap analysis tell you? It tells you the exact same thing every time. You don't have MFA, you don't have antivirus, you don't have continuous monitoring. So what we said is, we are engineers, we have done this for a long time. I'm going to give you everything that you need. I'm going to give you the pipeline. Now you tell me if the government is asking you for antivirus or continuous monitoring or MFA, is that really a FedRAMP requirement, or is that really a common sense cybersecurity requirement? And the question is, I think all of us will in general agree that the general trend has been to try and improve corporate cybersecurity through sort of a more opt-in model, right? So we created the cybersecurity standard from NIST, but it looks like the carrot model is not working so much. So maybe there is a different model that's needed.
Yeah. We heard a little bit about it today. The NCD's coming with the regulations. So,
Well, one thing to add though is that the one industry that we do see, somebody mentioned it, but financial services, they really take it to the next level, and they really go above and beyond, asking for things that maybe sometimes 853 is not even asking for. So that's an area where we see that somebody was mentioning that pain point of sometimes you need to go above and beyond for them, for that particular set of customers, versus what you're already doing in your standard, might be FedRAMP authorized cloud.
let me pick at that a little bit. Are you seeing one of, and I'll preface this, one of the complaints that we hear, and we mentioned it earlier today, is that government agencies are incentivized to default to the highest level, highest baseline naturally, right? They're not all, but some are not doing the risk management work behind it. So over to the question about the financial services that are going above and beyond the 853 catalog of controls, do you find that that is being done through the lens of good risk management, or do you think it is overkill, or what's driving it here? And the reason I'm asking is because if we're going to go and turn around and say, look, we need to make this more ubiquitous across all critical infrastructure sectors. Government's a critical infrastructure sector, and it should map to every other one that we're doing. We have to be pretty kind of clear on what we think the good is, what the it looks like. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, clearly I'm biased in this regard, but I
Sure.
think it is overkill. But to tie it back to that IG report that came out, I think the problem that, or rather the perspective of the FinServs are that, they are clear that this risk is still their risk. They still own the risk. And therefore, they're going to kick the tires hard. If they're going to use a cloud service provider, they're going to make sure that they're kicking the tires hard, that we're doing as much or more than they would have done themselves, right? That's part of like using the cloud and getting some of those benefits, but they are very clear that the risk is still with them. Something bad happens, is going to be on them. So that IG report is basically pointing out that maybe on the federal space, they might have over-rotated. They might have said, oh, you got StateRAMP, or you got, well, not StateRAMP, but you have DOD, IL4, or you have FedRAMP, then we're done. Sign the contract, we're done. But that's not the case, right? They are actually more responsible for Conmon, or taking our Conmon output, making it theirs, and making sure that they're addressing those risks. Yes, I agree with what the gentleman said, that yes, there's always going to be vulnerabilities, but you have to prove that you're doing something about them, or you're at least aware. And I think that report was highlighting that a lot of times they're not aware, right? Or maybe they did it that first assessment, year 1, year 2, year 3, they have no idea that there's these other open poem items that they should be doing something around, or maybe not doing something around, but they should either take the CSP to task or have a mitigating plan in place.
And just for those who aren't following what we're talking about here, DoD's IG found that they randomly selected 5, I believe, different cloud services, audited how they are taking the JAB and the DoD CIOs and DISA reviews of authorizations, and are just accepting them whole cloth, is what the IG's claiming in the report. So that's what you're referencing there, and basically trusting the process that is being done by the JAB or by DISA to compensate for them doing the actual assessment controls. Look, I think, and we don't want to go down that rabbit hole too deep. That's a interesting
Ross, I do want
report.
to provide a perspective. I think
Sure.
that report, I think, is a great report, and I think all it does is it just speaks to what's necessary, right? So not to bring DC lingo here, but the reality is what FedRAMP gives you, or the DISA Cloud PMO gives you, is a provisional authorization. So what that basically means is that still the agency or the system owner's prerogative is to go in and review the risk and give the actual ATO. And I think all that the the DoD report did is, hey, you still own that responsibility. It is a provisional. It doesn't mean just because JAB or DoD has given sort of the provisional assessment that you don't have to look at it at all, right? So I think it's more of an education thing, and I think reports like that sort of are important to keep the general health of the shared responsibility model in place. So I think it was the system working as if not working in my mind.
So let's shift the discussion a little bit, right? We're one of the things that Dave Zvenich said that I found interesting is the use of partner models to really kind of, whether it's inherited controls, whether it's going through the process as a joint offering. I'm curious what you guys think about that particular comment. That's what struck me as something to think about. And I mean, knowing how government buys, government doesn't look at a specific nuanced product offering. They look at the problem that they have or the mission that they're trying to solve, and they say, what vertically integrated stack of technology can I bring in and help me solve my problem? So that's a government perspective. I'm curious what you guys as solution providers think about the idea of going through this compliance process with partners. Is that a realistic thing?
I guess another question would be what, when you talk about partners, I mean, that's, it could mean a lot of things. And I mean, yes, I mean, we do go through partners.
Okay.
When I run on Google, that's a partner. I run on AWS, that's a partner. I run an Equinix, so that's a partner. And I think it's important to build and inherit a lot of those controls. I mean, that's key. I mean, the gentleman here that spoke earlier about moving from AWS to Google. I mean, that is actually much easier than you think because you get to inherit Google's controls. You'll still have to show what the differences are between the product set. But I mean, I think that's what we do every day. I mean, whether I'm working with StackArmor or it's always a partnership. From that standpoint, that's how I view it. So, how you guys?
Yeah, no, I think, in the context of partnerships, absolutely. I think, one of the things I think the gentleman from CISA pointed out, Grant, I think his point was valid, right? It's about, risk. How do you go in and, manage some of these big risks? And, what we would call the hyperscalers, are, in a better position, resourcing, skill, capability wise. And I think the partnership model is exactly as, Steve described, is to leverage some of these, hyperscale technologies, not just them. I mean, you have other models too, right? You have PaaS and SaaS and others. I think that's where, I think the partnership model comes in. And I think some of the things too is, you know, compliance is never static, right? I mean, so you see the evolution of technologies and, you have serverless computing, you have container-based computing. And so more and more of the responsibility is taken on by, a Google or, some other provider. And so the responsibility, that you as a CSP or as a SaaS provider continues to, reduce. So I think, in that context, definitely the partnership model is, I think doing more of that makes sense to me.
Okay. Alvarez.
It does. The one thing that you mentioned at the beginning, like some of the things that came to mind from the previous discussions,
Yeah.
and the one thing that came to mind is, I agree, FedRAMP PMO, very, they're friends, they're good allies. We still see the issue with the throughput, right?
Okay.
And the throughput is not with the FedRAMP. Well, it is partially with the FedRAMP PMO, but more importantly with the jab.
It's the jab. Yeah.
And
Let's be
so-
clear. The PMO's gotten much better. The jab is the big problem.
Yeah, well, I don't want to say that, but
I'll say it.
but-
Matt can call me. We can have that discussion.
yeah, so that's still a problem. So yes, the partnership ecosystem might be growing and growing and growing, and maybe that's a faster path, but you still have to deal with the jab getting prioritized. They have a very limited queue. Getting through that queue, showing enough of that business case. I believe Brian mentioned that. That's also a challenge. And also when you have on the StateRAMP side, they made the conscious decision of like, you can be a work in progress versus on the FedRAMP, it's kind of like a chicken and egg, right? Like, well, how can I bid enough on contracts to show the business case if we don't have FedRAMP? And we need FedRAMP to show up at the table.
Yep.
Not all the time, obviously. Like some agencies might blink or squint, but that's a challenge. And if the jab is on the critical path and they don't have, and well, I would say part of it is also they don't have enough resources.
It's resources. Yeah, I agree.
right?
It's a resource.
And also OSCAL. I don't think OSCAL is the solution. It might accelerate some of the maintenance, etc. But at the end of the day, you need humans to make decisions, and the
Okay.
jab is those humans.
Okay. Well, so let's solve the problem.
Can I make one more comment on the partner thing?
Sure.
And also don't forget, if you're a FedRAMP jab high, if you elect to use a partner, they have to be, no exceptions, FedRAMP jab high. So there's about 11 of us that have it now, maybe 12 FedRAMP jab highs. So this is an understandable request. So there has to be partnering. I mean, I look around the room. I know several of the people in this room that use Zscaler as their security stack.
Sure.
Like I said, I use the several partners I buy stuff from in this room. The partnership has to be there because the rules force it.
Yep.
So we just got to get better at working together and trying to get some of these products either up to the high level sooner, or Jazz is going to have to start realizing that not everybody can afford or want to go to high, but I need their product.
So let's get into how. Let's solve this, because I know that you guys have participated in drafting letters to FedRAMP and other people on how to do this. So let me lay out the scenario. We've got 3 agencies: DoD, DHS, and GSA. All of them have JAB representation where its other duties is assigned, more or less, right? They're all doing the folks who are reviewing these authorization packages all have other jobs. So to your point, Stephen, absolutely we need more resources to bring in more people who can pay more attention to that. But that's not going to solve the problem, because in addition, we've got people who are learning different products. As we're talking about a growth in cloud and a growth in the partnerships, we're not just looking at specific infrastructure providers providing broad elastic compute capability. We're talking SaaS applications that do all kind of things. So everybody's got to be an identity expert. Everybody's got to be an AI expert. Everybody's got to be. So how are we solving the pipeline issue broadly? What are some recommendations? More money for sure. What else?
What other thing you left off that list is consistency.
Consistency. Well, yeah,
that is probably the biggest challenge with the jab is the inconsistency.
Yeah.
Certain ones are really, really good and seasoned, and the newer ones aren't, and that's not their issue. They're learning, but there's no consistency in the process.
Yeah.
First of all, is to try to build some consistency in how they do this.
Got it.
And then they can start talking about how to grow it. But if they don't build consistency
Amen.
and have pure standards of how to do this right the same way every single time, it creates almost like a managed chaos.
Yeah. And well, look, this is one of the things that we're advocating for aggressively as ADI. We are saying that there needs to be a governance framework and process over top of the jab that provides that consistent review where you're not getting one recommendation or on one side and somebody else saying something completely different. And that has to be in place. And look, we can say this here. We know that they're hearing what we're saying over there. So that's positive. What else do we need? What else do we need? Is it just resources and governance, or what else?
If I may add, Ross, I think something that was said earlier is important, right? The biggest thing that drives agencies is mission impact, right? One thing that's very interesting and almost frightening to me is for I think everybody in this room and everybody on the panel and generally agrees is FedRAMP first and foremost was a tremendous experiment in building a brand new cybersecurity program. And I think for what you heard today is it has global acceptance, right? All of us know, the gentleman this morning talked about, how he was in the meeting with the Singaporean government, and they talked about FedRAMP. And we see this every day, right? I mean, the FedRAMP marketplace is the gold standard. Anybody, for that matter, who wants to go and buy a cloud service goes to the FedRAMP marketplace to go and check out whether or not the software is. So it's not just federal agencies, but I think what's very interesting is there has been no study or documentation that suggests what is the impact in cost savings or the ROI that FedRAMP has had. If we talk about, we do this every day, and I'm sure all of you can do this as well. If there are 5,000 reuses of an ATO, roughly an ATO ballpark costs about $100,000. So you're talking about $500 million of savings. So I think in my mind, some of these things in terms of resources, tactics, etc., maybe could be solved by talking about the impact that this program has. How are agencies saving money, meeting their mission better. And maybe that'll ease the sponsorship problem. That'll make it easier for Congress to provide more money, or whatever good things start to flow. So I think the biggest thing we can do collectively is to help organizations go in and understand the value of what FedRAMP, and more importantly, the companies that have invested that money and have taken the leap of faith to go and bring these tremendous SaaS solutions to them, and the value. I think a lot of things will fall into place. If to me, that's the biggest gap we see right now.
Albert, what are you seeing from a gap standpoint? I mean,
To me, it's simple. It's just the resources, the personnel resources that the job. I mean, there's also the consistency. Actually, that's a great point. You do see the different viewpoints. You can tell when we read a comment back from them, we can tell who wrote it. Which agency.
We do. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Kumar and I have that discussion all the time. I know who wrote that.
Yeah, or sometimes they'll actually disagree, like in live meetings, in terms of interpretation, and sometimes they will be inconsistent in interpretations, or in some cases, we think maybe DoD will have a very specific, maybe more stringent stance. Maybe DHS this time around decides to no, we're gonna draw a line in the sand. This is the one we're gonna, this is the hill. And DoD might say, well, that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't actually go. It doesn't align with the requirements. So I think consistency is a big issue. How to solve for that when we're saying, well, you need to have more people that are going to be, newer people, not as familiar with the systems, with the program, with the requirements, with security, et cetera. That's a big challenge. The other thing that we're seeing is that decision making is making sure that they are empowered to make the decisions at the TRR level.
Yeah.
Versus having to wait for what appears to be monthly meetings to bring things up to the TRs, right? And then suddenly, if a meeting is missed, or they couldn't get time with the TR, or the TR had feedback, it's a game of telephone between the TRRs and the TRs and ourselves.
I think that's a very important point. Pushing down the decision-making process so that the person who's doing the reviewing and making the recommendation can make the call.
And maybe part of that is guidance and just being very explicit, saying, all right, this is the requirement. What exactly is behind that requirement, right? For them to have more explicit guidance, for them to make better decisions themselves.
Well, and I'm a process guy too. You don't have to wait for a monthly meeting to have a conversation, right? If there's a way to flip it, and then maybe this gets back to resourcing, flip it up and have that conversation with the TR quicker. Maybe that makes it move faster. There's a couple of different areas that we can talk about now, and I think we talked a lot about StateRAMP in the last one, and the use of a program at the state level. It's one of those things that 2 years ago people were talking about whether or not it was necessary. I'm curious what your opinions are and where you guys come down on a program like StateRAMP and how that either impacts or helps or hurts, or what we need to see a program like StateRAMP adopt from FedRAMP in order to make it more effective.
I mean, we love StateRAMP. We were, one of the first to get it, and we saw the value in it. And we have a separate SLED division, and they've had a tremendous success since the rollout of StateRAMP, of selling the brand. Even though they could sell it as FedRAMP, all of a sudden we get StateRAMP, and now they're selling more of our FedRAMP based cloud to the states, and they're selling our commercial cloud. So it obviously it worked. It gave comfort to some of the states that we were there. And what do you want to see out of it? I think the cool thing about it is we're not as applied to us, but from an ADI point of view, the ability to get the local player, that the local cloud compute player that works in the state. A lot of times the state has a requirement. They want to obviously check vendors in the state first, or the vendors that are doing business in the state. It allows the smaller guy to get to market quicker, and I think that's brilliant. I mean, that really helps out. And I think it's the right program going in the right direction. And it's growing, and they've had the opportunity to learn from some of the mistakes that FedRAMP had, which they've done. But yeah, I'm very supportive.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
If I can just add to it, I think, in my mind, there are a couple of really important things I think that StateRAMP represents. One of them is, and I think something you talked about earlier, Ross, is I think StateRAMP is almost implementing the success of the FedRAMP blueprint for cloud security. And StateRAMP, I think, has taken that model and applied it to another domain. I think some question that you asked earlier was, SOC 2 or others, I think there is an opportunity for us to have a larger debate on what effective cybersecurity governance means.
Yep.
And is it that, is I feel that, the reason the success for, programs like FedRAMP and StateRAMP is because there's a fundamental deficiency in the current commercial programs. And I think what StateRAMP has done, I hope somebody can take what they have done and apply it somewhere else. I mean, StateRAMP didn't come in and reinvent a new set of controls. They could have, but they didn't, right? So they took the existing set of baselines, existing set of processes, and said, you know what? There is a community of providers who are never going to have a federal agency and sponsor. I'm sorry. And so I think maybe there are other industries, and so I'm a big fan of StateRAMP, but I think it's a model and a blueprint for future cybersecurity, models.
Yep.
Well, can you just
Sure. Go ahead.
I mean, my favorite thing about StateRAMP first is reciprocity. And then after that is it does what was mentioned before that FedRAMP does. It provides this information, very, very deep information that no other compliance program besides FedRAMP does to, state and local agencies for them to make those same risk-based decisions that the federal government is able to do via FedRAMP. So I think elevating that or having a vehicle to consistently and securely provide that information to those decision makers for them to, evaluate the risk is one of the key things that StateRAMP is doing.
Okay. And you don't see it as perpetuating states to really drive requirements, right? So that one of the things that I've heard from some members is there's a concern that there's going to be a state that thinks that their level of security is more serious than their neighboring state, and therefore they're going to have requirements that are higher, which is their prerogative right now, right? Is that going to cause all of the boats to rise when something like that happens, or do you see it still being able to be? Uh, do you see that individual risk management still staying individual? I guess is the question.
I'll add to that. I mean, you see that in FedRAMP too. You don't just see that in
So
StateRAMP.
it's one of the
That's nothing different. I mean, we get FedRAMP requirement of FedRAMP, and then there's the must be all U.S. citizens, must be everything stays in the state. I mean, all the things that FedRAMP doesn't cover, that we still get thrown into probably 80-90% of our, well, 100% of anything above civilian, and probably 80% of civilian when you're talking the bigger agencies. It's FedRAMP plus many other things.
Yep.
So that's no different.
Yeah, plus, I think one fundamental thing to remember, and I think, Alvaro mentioned it, FedRAMP or StateRAMP are baselines, right? So
Sure.
there is nothing that stops you for doing more and above. All FedRAMP or StateRAMP or these programs are saying is, hey, look, for you to operate securely in the cloud, this is what you need to do, right? So in my mind, it's perfectly possible, and as Steve said, it happens today, even today, where you might have an agency that's perfectly at liberty to go in and impose additional controls, which go into a beautiful appendix, and it's taken care of.
Ha. All right, we've got about 5 minutes
Well, real
left.
quick, I just want
Yeah.
to add to that one thing. I mean, it's you need to not only think about FedRAMP controls being the way to get in, you also have to think about what your customers are going to buy, right? So I mean, I've done a lot of FedRAMPs where people just did it right to the controls, and you know what? They never sold any business because they had people in wherever country taking calls, the data leaving the U.S. These are not parameters of FedRAMP moderate. I mean, you can do all that in FedRAMP moderate. Your customer's not going to buy it. So you need to think not only the customer's asking you got to make an internal decision of what the customer's going to buy. The end customer wants to buy. So there's more to it than just what FedRAMP says and what the customer asks. There's things that we should do too.
Yeah. So I said we got 5 minutes. If there's any audience questions, please come up to the microphone. Yeah, come on.
You scored over there, but we're talking StateRAMP.
I was just in complete agreement. To GP's point, one thing we always say is the baselines are the bare minimum, right? It's kind of like 17 pieces of flare, in which case most CSPs just do enough, right? So the other item is everything above the baseline is contract by contract. So in terms of whether or not the states are going to drive, absolutely, but it's no different from agency to agency. And then the last thing I'd add is early on during the early FedRAMP days, we always said the PMO was like a box of chocolates. You never knew what you were going to get.
Kumar.
Is it audible? Can you hear me? Yeah. Suggestion to the earlier question you had, Ross, is about what could we do or what can we suggest for JAB to go faster?
Yeah.
And avoiding the choke point, right? Definitely cost is a big factor. I think we all agree to it. But my question is, what does these hyperscalers can do to enable the JAB reviewers to adapt to the new technology, to get the knowledge of new technology, so it doesn't take a long poll for them to go review bones with somebody else, another technical reviewer giving an opinion about it, because they're probably not the subject matter experts. So how could you empower the first line of defense who is sitting with the CSPs to be able to gain the knowledge? I mean, yes, when they get the budget available for them, they can get themselves trained. But to fast track this, can the hyperscalers today, for benefit of their own business, right? CSPs coming on to them, if they can enable the first line of defense from the JAB perspective, engage them, coach them to the extent that you would offer some of these advanced courses for free, get them more equipped for us to go through the pipe, is an immediate short-term solution, I think, as a suggestion.
Okay. Any reaction to that, Albert?
I mean, the thought comes to mind that it'll still come down to consistency on all the TRRs and whether they're empowered to make those, let's call them, out of the box decisions. In our experience, they can't. In our experience, they always have to go to their leads, and then their leads will defer to the TRs, and then we have to wait for that to come down from 3 different TRs, right? That might have different questions or different viewpoints. Um, I do appreciate the thought. I just think that still we need them to be able to make decisions faster, and maybe part of that is workload, is them actually being focused on just doing FedRAMP work for X number of CSPs, having that dedicated work to potentially have more throughput and have more engaging conversations. So we, for example, we meet with our JAB reviewers once a week. It used to be bi-weekly, but nothing was moving. So we're like, all right, let's just do it once a week to put them on the hotspot. And it's still not moving. But at least we have more opportunities to have conversations and try to deal with their questions, right, in real time. And then if they want to have deeper dives, we usually have a spot like on Fridays where, it works for everyone. We'll have those deeper dives. Maybe we bring in some Eng folks for a particular area. But I do appreciate the sentiment of, if we can empower the TRRs, if that were to help, then yes, let's absolutely invest in that.
So I want to go through, and I want to frame a question for everybody to kind of close out with. So think about this. For ADI, we want to encourage more companies. This is why we're here on the West Coast. We want to encourage more companies to partner with and do work with all public sector entities, whether it's the federal government or state and local government. And so what advice, as folks who are deeply familiar and involved and passionately trying to work with the organization to make it as better, as efficient as possible, what advice would you give to companies that want to or considering doing business with the government when it comes to dealing with the JAB or dealing with FedRAMP or dealing with StateRAMP and compliance? GP, you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. So just a quick backstory. Before I started StackArmor, before I got into the cloud business, I actually used to run a federal market intelligence and data analytics company. I'll get to your questions. And what you invariably found was most commercial entities, 20 to 30% of their revenue came from the federal or public sector market. And the reason for that was simple. It was resiliency of your revenue. Yes, we heard all the challenges and, understand federal contracting and its, challenges. But the reality of it is, for most SaaS companies where valuations are based on ARR, I think the reality is that most federal agencies and customers will provide you a revenue stream which is multi-year and fairly steady. I call it recession-proof. I think from an economic standpoint, I think if you're an ISV or technology manufacturer, I think you'll find from a pure business standpoint, a revenue stream that's steady, and I think it'll counteract some of the cyclicals that you see on the I think commercial side. So while there are these challenges, but the reality is, and I don't mean to call out any names, but you have Rupen from Bluescape here, and I would if you're scared about FedRAMP and such, talk to him. I mean, these guys know engineering, and it's a young organization that has traveled that journey and some, right? So it's not that it's unsurmountable, but again, I think it's a valuable marketplace for you to all be in, which is growing. It's growing fast. So,
Alvaro, you want to go next?
I mean, dealing with the government.
So we're encouraged. I mean, basically, you guys are expanding in the public sector space. How are you encouraging partners to, as somebody said earlier, go through the gauntlet that is the compliance process? Like, what is the incentive? What are you telling companies right now to get them to come partner with you guys to go and provide the latest, greatest technology to the government folks?
Yeah, I mean, you can't beat a statement as recession proof. We've definitely seen. I've been at Google for almost 5 years. Working on all the things, including public sector all this time. We've definitely seen that demand is just not unbearable, but close to it. And of course, when you have that pressure of all these different things that the customers want, because Google Cloud's always launching new services,
Sure.
versus trying to get them through the Spartan gauntlet of JAB. So we've definitely seen that demand continue to grow. And obviously, when we see things, new vehicles like StateRAMP, we also, that helps with that demand. So to slightly backpedal on my last comment, I think at the end of the day, people want to learn. And so whenever we've dealt with agencies going through like our poem, for example, right, they are eager to learn, to understand, to really feel like they understand the technology and how we do things, potentially how they might be able to do things. So yeah, I think being open to when dealing with whether it's the JAB, PMO, the agencies that might be giving you an authorization, and making it a learning opportunity for them, I think that's an incentive for them to maybe more quickly engage with you and work with you on authorizations and using your service.
Okay.
I do it all the time. I talk to ISVs all the time, and I'm working with a rather large one right now. Helping them understand the process. And the only advice I would give is, please do reach out. I love the gap analysis. I don't do a certification in any part of the world that doesn't have a gap analysis first. So it's just a firm belief of mine to understand what I need to do. It's not really where the holes in my product are. It's what are the controls that I don't have answered in some other certification I've done. And then the other thing I would say is cost. I mean, this is, I tell everybody that goes for FedRAMP, it's not a one-time fee, right? Whatever you are budgeting for FedRAMP, you need to budget that every single year for your continuous monitoring and all the SCRs and keep up. So, I mean, and I can tell you that's probably right on the money. So, those are things that you have to consider. But, I think the great thing about going FedRAMP is or StateRAMP, it's going to make your company better. You're going to learn things you didn't know. You're going to get better at it. And then you could take that if you're like we do, take that data and build it into how we respond to other certifications here in the US, or that's we IRAP, in Australia. We're doing ISMAP in Japan, and because we've got all these controls pulled through FedRAMP, it's very easy for us to respond and to grow our worldwide public sector business as well. So I mean, I think that there's the benefits. The benefits are there. I think you heard them. Don't be afraid of them. I mean, there's not a fear of FedRAMP, right? These are people or StateRAMP. They want to help, so talk to them too, and that's what I would say.
Actually, can I just tie that last thought to what I said and also a few earlier things? So customers don't want to know that you're going to provide them the solution that they need. They want to know how exactly to do the work themselves. They literally want, an implementation guide, integration guide. They want you to walk them through it for how to successfully use your solution under FedRAMP, under StateRAMP. And I think that goes back to the whole risk thing, right? Is tell them exactly what they need to do and how to do it in just plain English terms is what a lot of them want to hear or want to know. And I think that opens a lot more doors than having the solution that meets what they need.
That's great. All right. With that, I think we are well over time, and a lot of people are hungry. So I think let's go get some lunch. Thank you guys again very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.